Russia and China's relationship is falling apart. In a shocking move, Russia's imposed a staggering 55% tariff on Chinese goods. This decision is more than just a number. It's a shockwave shaking the very foundations of global trade. But why would Russia, seemingly a close ally of China, take such a drastic step against a friend? And why now? Answering this question will give us a head start in understanding what could be the first in a series of chaotic decisions by Putin. In this video, we'll peel back the layers of this story for you, uncover the motivations, the immediate economic impacts, and the far-reaching consequences of this bold tariff. By the end of it, you'll have a deeper understanding of how these international maneuvers play out on the world stage and affect our everyday lives. As we always say, there are no permanent friends or enemies in geopolitics. There are just permanent interests, and this situation between Moscow and Beijing truly reaffirms that. Your support for our content is always very much appreciated, especially when we have CCP bots and the algorithm heavily suppressing our reach every time. We take pride in bringing you uncensored, impartial news, as we would hope any channel would. So these bans and strikes that we've been receiving are quite shocking. Please keep liking and sharing our content as that does wonders for us. First, let's go over the details of the tariffs before we get into how Russia will pay for this big blunder. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is this 55% tariff all about? A tariff, simply put, is a tax imposed by a government on imported goods. In this case, Russia's decided to place a 55% tariff on Chinese furniture parts. They've done this by reclassifying sliding rail parts used in Chinese furniture and categorizing them alongside furniture parts with bearings, which then attracts a 55.65% tariff. This means that importing these furniture parts into Russia from China is now vastly more expensive than before. What's most shocked the world is that this tariff has not been universal, but has been levied specifically against Chinese goods only. Similar furniture parts from European countries are subject to tariffs of no higher than 10%, and yet Chinese exporters are being required to pay almost 6 times that amount. This significant difference in tariff rates has raised questions and concerns among industry insiders about the fairness and impact of the new tariff on Chinese imports. More than that, it's publicly revealed the cracks in the Sino-Russian relations, exposing their seemingly perfect relationship as a sham. The first question to perhaps ask amidst all this is, why are tariffs being imposed in the first place? In general, when a country imposes a tariff, it raises the cost of imported goods. This move is typically aimed at protecting domestic industries by making imported goods more expensive and less competitive compared to locally produced items. In the case of Russia, the government allegedly imposed this heavy tariff to protect its domestic furniture industry. By making Chinese furniture parts more expensive, the logic is that Russian manufacturers get a better shot at competing in the market, which revitalizes the local industry and strengthens their struggling economy. But why do this now? Well, the timing of this decision is very critical. Russia and China have had a relatively close economic relationship, so this move might seem surprising at first. However, there are several underlying reasons for this decision when you start to look at it closely. Firstly, there's the issue of economic pressure. Russia, like many countries, is looking to bolster its domestic industries, especially in light of its various economic challenges, including sanctions and a fluctuating global economy. As of January 2024, Russia has over 16,000 sanctions imposed by various countries and organizations worldwide. These sanctions, which target individuals, companies, institutions, vessels, and planes, have cut 5% from Russia's economic growth over the past 2 years, according to the US Treasury. That's why Russia needs all the economic relief it can get. By imposing a high tariff on Chinese imports, Russia hopes to incentivize domestic production, potentially leading to job creation and economic growth. These new 55% tariffs are not the first restrictions to come this year either, with similar economic ambitions. In May 2024, Russian officials began considering measures to protect their domestic automotive industry. This was driven by concerns that the increasing number of Chinese car imports was hurting local manufacturers. By October 2024, Russia officially announced an increase in the utilization fee for imported cars, which acts much like a tariff. What does this mean in practical terms? Essentially, the utilization fee is a type of environmental tax that is applied to cars. By increasing this fee for Chinese cars, Russia's made these imports more expensive. This move is intended to encourage customers to buy locally made vehicles instead of imported ones. The rationale behind this was much like the logic from before. It was meant to protect the domestic industry, boost local production, and safeguard jobs. The higher fees apply specifically to Chinese cars, making them less competitive in the Russian market. When questioned on why the move targeted China, experts explained that Chinese automakers have been rapidly increasing their market share in Russia, offering a wide range of affordable and attractive vehicles. By imposing higher tariffs, Russia's trying to level the playing field for its own manufacturers who struggle to compete with the lower prices of Chinese imports. China didn't make so much as a noise, and now, less than 2 months down the road, Russia's doubled down. Secondly, and most importantly, there's a strategic geopolitical element at play. Trade policies are often used as tools in broader geopolitical strategies. By imposing this tariff, Russia might be seeking to negotiate better trade terms with China or assert its economic sovereignty. There are already several issues that are pending between the two economic giants that need hashing out, and it seems that this will be a card that Russia plays to its advantage. We'll be getting into that in a few minutes. For now, let's talk more about the unexpected economic impact that will arise from this tariff. It's not like it will just fly unnoticed under the radar. Starting with Russia, it's clear that this hefty tariff will have both positive and negative effects on the Russian economy. On the positive side, this move could provide a significant boost to Russia's domestic furniture industry. By making imported Chinese parts more expensive, local manufacturers gain a competitive edge. This could lead to increased production, higher sales, and potentially more jobs in the industry. In turn, this could stimulate economic growth and reduce unemployment in the sector. This is especially important as the Russian furniture industry has been in big trouble lately. Chinese furniture parts have dominated the Russian market, with imports estimated at around $1.3 billion annually, all while Russia's furniture industry is grappling with a sharp decline in consumer demand due to rising inflation, reduced household purchasing power, and changing market dynamics. However, as wonderful as it seems, there are also potential drawbacks to consider. One major concern is the reality of retaliatory measures from China. Trade wars often escalate, with countries imposing tariffs on each other's goods in a tit-for-tat manner. If China decides to impose its own tariffs on Russian goods, this could harm other sectors in the Russian economy that rely on exports to China. This would be especially bad given there's a lot of resilience from China at the moment, a fact I'll expand on in a few minutes. Moreover, higher tariffs can lead to increased production costs for Russian manufacturers who rely on imported Chinese parts. This could result in higher prices for consumers and potentially lower profit margins for businesses. That's why some Russian industry leaders are unhappy with this move. Alex Shestakov, owner of the first furniture factory, said in a statement regarding this tariff imposition, "We risk seeing the closure of dozens of factories and thousands of job losses in the coming months." It's a delicate balance, and the long-term impact will depend on how both countries navigate this complex situation. Turning our focus to China, the impact of this tariff is equally significant. Chinese exporters who rely heavily on the Russian market will likely feel the pinch. The increased cost of their products due to the tariff could lead to a decline in sales, affecting their revenues and profitability. The furniture industry in China is substantial, and many businesses have built their operations around exporting to various global markets, including Russia. As of 2024, the revenue in China's furniture market amounts to $88.41 billion, with growth projections of 7.68% between now and 2029. The 55% tariff that Russia's imposed represents a considerable barrier, making it much more challenging for these businesses to compete. This could result in reduced production, layoffs, and financial strain for affected companies. This will no doubt be a problem for Beijing, as the furniture industry is a significant part of China's economy. The industrial sector, which includes furniture manufacturing, contributed 31.7% to China's GDP in 2023, so its contributions are regarded as valuable to the nation, hence any decrease in business will be noticeable to the nation's bottom line. Also, given that China's the world's largest furniture producer and exporter, it's safe to say that the furniture industry plays a substantial role in China's global leadership ambitions. It's almost impossible that Beijing will take this Russian act lying down, potentially setting the stage for trade conflict between these two giants. Bringing it back to a grassroots level, the effects of this tariff extend beyond just the businesses involved and right back to the consumers. Ironically, Russian consumers in particular are likely to feel the impact in their wallets. With the cost of Chinese furniture parts rising due to the tariffs, prices for finished furniture products are also expected to increase. This means that consumers in Russia may have to pay more for their furniture, affecting household budgets and overall spending. Higher furniture prices could lead to reduced consumer spending in other areas, potentially impacting the broader economy. Additionally, the reduced availability of affordable imported furniture could limit consumer choices. This could force consumers to settle for lower quality products or pay a premium for higher quality items. It's a ripple effect that highlights the interconnectedness of global trade and its direct impact on everyday life. It's no wonder then that furniture industry leaders and associations in both Russia and China have voiced their opinions on this tariff, and their reactions are mixed. In Russia, some domestic manufacturers welcome the move, seeing it as an opportunity to strengthen the local market and reduce dependency on imports. They believe that this tariff will give them the competitive edge they need to thrive. However, some other industry experts and business associations have expressed concerns about the potential long-term effects. They worry that increased production costs and potential retaliatory measures from China could create more challenges for the industry. Additionally, some businesses that rely on imported Chinese parts for their production processes may face difficulties in sourcing affordable alternatives. Alexander Shestakov, president of AMD-PR, said in another statement that condemned the move, "Such a strong increase in duties could lead to the bankruptcy of many importers of furniture components and an inevitable rise in the price of domestic furniture by at least 15%. In China, the reaction's been largely negative, as expected. Exporters and industry leaders view the tariff as a significant barrier to their business operations. Expressing his frustration on the matter, Du Wan, a columnist for NetEase News, said, "If such actions had come from the United States, positive energy experts would have long condemned it as doomed hegemonic behavior. Yet in the face of Russia's ruthless measures, they remain silent, spineless as jellyfish. Many have called on the government to take action to protect their interests and negotiate with Russia to reduce or eliminate the tariff. A lot of Chinese businesses are unhappy and are viewing Russia's actions as traitorous. Let me explain why." Before moving forward, I want to share that I'm tired of seeing ads everywhere I go. I mean, how many ads has YouTube shown you on this video alone? That's why we launched a newsletter a few years ago called Global Recaps. We've been sending news daily right to you with no ads. Yeah, that's right. We've sent 2,500 newsletters, but not one of them contained an ad. So if you want global news with no ads and no censorship, this is the solution for you. Sign up now by scanning the QR code on the screen or link in the description. Sign up today and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. A key thing to note when it comes to this situation is the fact that the geopolitical landscape plays a critical role in understanding the broader implications of this tariff. Right now, the world is seeing a lot of shifting alliances and rising tensions. One of the major factors in this is the ongoing trade war between the United States and China. These two economic giants have been imposing tariffs and trade barriers on each other, disrupting global supply chains and affecting businesses worldwide. This US-China trade war has had ripple effects, causing other countries to reconsider their trade policies and alliances. It's possible that in a bid to try and cozy up to the new Trump administration, Russia's imposed this tariff to show that they can be a friend to the West, something that Putin desperately needs. It's estimated that between the sanctions and the war, Russia's losing $10 billion a day. It comes as no surprise then that with a new president coming in, Russia might be looking at softening those relationships so it can find a respectable way out, even if it means stepping on China's toes just a little bit. By playing nice with the US, Putin could clearly be looking to diversify his economy and reduce dependency on any single trade partner, as that equally places him in trouble. When you keep that in mind, it then makes sense why Russia would impose heavy tariffs on China before even Trump himself has. Though all this could indeed be speculative rumors or just frustrations being vented out, there is some merit in them. After all, it seems in the world of geopolitics, nations are constantly seeking alternative markets and strategies to mitigate their economic fallout. Speaking of alternative markets, as Chinese exporters grapple with the effects of the tariff, finding alternative markets becomes a crucial strategy. Diversifying their market base away from Russia can help mitigate the impact of the tariff and ensure business continuity. One potential avenue is exploring opportunities in Southeast Asia. There, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand are known for their growing manufacturing sector and favorable trade agreements, and would make for more than capable markets. They have growing economies and increasing demand for various products, including furniture. By establishing trade relationships with these countries, Chinese exporters can offset the loss in the Russian market and tap into new revenue streams. Another possibility is expanding into African markets. Many African countries are experiencing economic growth and urbanization, leading to increased demand for consumer goods, including furniture. By targeting these markets, Chinese exporters can diversify their customer base and reduce their reliance on any single market. Additionally, enhancing trade relationships with other major economies, such as the European Union or India, could provide new opportunities for Chinese businesses. Simply put, China has several economic strategies in place to expand its influence and create new markets for its products. One of the most ambitious is the Belt and Road Initiative. Launched in 2013 by President Xi Jinping, the BRI aims to develop trade routes and infrastructure projects across Asia, Europe, and Africa. By investing in infrastructure and fostering trade links, China hopes to create new economic opportunities and strengthen its global influence for situations exactly like this. It's a deterrent against ever being cut off, and even when their closest allies betray them, as we're seeing now, it means President Xi got something right. The imposition of the tariff by Russia might push China to accelerate its efforts under the BRI and seek stronger ties with other regions. This could involve investing more in infrastructure projects in Africa and Latin America particularly, where demand for Chinese products might be growing. While these markets may present their own challenges, diversifying trade partnerships can help mitigate the risks associated with tariffs and trade conflicts. With this current situation out of the way, we have to wonder how we got here. The only way we can fully understand the significance of the seemingly abrupt 55% tariff is to look at the historical trade relations between Russia and China. What many may not know is that these two countries share a long history of economic interaction, characterized by periods of cooperation and conflict. In the early 20th century, trade between Russia and China was limited, primarily due to political and ideological differences. However, as both countries underwent significant political changes, their trade relations began to evolve. The establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 and the Soviet Union's support played a crucial role in shaping their early economic interactions. During the Cold War era, Russia, then the Soviet Union, and China had a complex relationship, marked by both cooperation and rivalry. While they were initially aligned as communist allies, ideological differences and geopolitical tensions led to a split in their relationship. Despite these challenges, trade between the two countries continued, though with fluctuations in volume and intensity. In the post-Cold War period, Russia and China have sought to rebuild and strengthen their economic ties. Several key milestones have marked this period of cooperation. For example, in 2001, the two countries signed the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation, which laid the foundation for closer economic and political relations. This treaty emphasized mutual respect, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, and cooperation in various fields, including trade and investment. Over the years, Russia and China have also signed numerous trade agreements and joint ventures, further solidifying their economic partnership. These have only become more numerous as the world has alienated Russia, throwing it into China's arms. These agreements have facilitated the exchange of goods, services, and investments, contributing to the growth of bilateral trade. The key sectors of cooperation that most of these treaties have focused on include energy, infrastructure, technology, and manufacturing. However, it's important to note that while Russia and China have enjoyed periods of cooperation, their trade relationship has not been without conflicts. Throughout history, there have been several instances of trade disputes and tensions between the two countries. One notable example is the dispute over tariffs and trade imbalances in the early 2000s. At that time, Russia imposed tariffs on certain Chinese goods, citing concerns about unfair trade practices and market imbalances. This led to tensions between the two countries, with China responding by imposing its own tariffs on Russian products. The conflict highlighted the challenges of maintaining a balanced and fair trade relationship, even among strategic partners. Another significant trade conflict occurred in the mid-2000s, when Russia implemented restrictions on Chinese agricultural imports. This move was driven by concerns over food safety and quality standards. The restrictions led to protests from Chinese exporters and strained trade relations between the two countries. Eventually, through negotiations and diplomatic efforts, the issue was resolved, and trade in agricultural products resumed. It seems a theme of Russia being the first to impose tariffs is emerging here. Also, we're seeing that China does not take these situations lying down, but rather it retaliates. This makes the present situation more of a problem, as a trade war would be imminent were China to act according to character. The more you look at this, the more you realize the fragility of this situation, which is much like a boiling pot about to blow its lid off. The problem with China retaliating, however, is that Russia simply cannot afford a war with China right now. In the wake of extensive international sanctions, Russia has increasingly turned to China as one of its few remaining reliable partners. Given that major economies like Australia, Canada, Norway, Japan, the United States, the EU, and the United Kingdom have since imposed bans on Russian goods because of the war in Ukraine, and this economic and political isolation has driven Russia to seek closer ties with Beijing. Because of this, bilateral trade between Russia and China has surged, with trade volumes more than doubling since 2020. In 2023, trade with China accounted for approximately one-third of Russia's total trade. Russia's exports to China, primarily consisting of 107 million metric tons of crude petroleum worth $51 billion, coal briquettes worth $9.64 billion, and petroleum gas worth $9.5 billion, have seen an annualized growth rate of 19.1% over the past 5 years. Conversely, China's exports to Russia, including broadcasting equipment worth $4.11 billion, computers worth $2.59 billion, and large construction vehicles worth $1.71 billion, have also grown significantly. This increase in trade only increases Moscow's dependency on Beijing, making them invaluable. The partnership extends beyond trade. China's become a crucial source of technology and investment for Russia. Amidst the sanctions, Russia has faced severe shortages in semiconductors and other key components, forcing it to rely on Chinese imports. Though this could prove to be a challenge in the future, given the bans that the US has imposed on such goods. Plus, Chinese investments in Russian infrastructure have been a big help. These investments in Russian infrastructure projects have been crucial in providing a much-needed economic lifeline for Russia, especially in the wake of international sanctions. These investments have focused on several key areas. For instance, Chinese investments have helped upgrade railway border crossings and modernize the cargo port at Vladivostok. These upgrades are essential for handling the increased trade volumes between the two countries. In logistics and shipping, Chinese companies have invested in firms like RTSB RUS, which ships cargo by rail across Russia. This has helped alleviate some of the pressure on Russia's logistics network, which has been strained by the surge in trade with China. While energy cooperation remains the backbone of Sino-Russian relations, Chinese investments have also supported the expansion of Russian exports by improving infrastructure. This includes projects like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the Crimea Bridge, which have received significant Chinese investment. Additionally, Chinese investments have focused on regional projects that are less headline-grabbing but crucial for easing bottlenecks in Russia's infrastructure. These projects include upgrading storage sites, increasing shipping container availability, and improving equipment at receiving depots. These investments have been instrumental in helping Russia pivot its trade focus towards Asia, especially after losing access to European markets. This collaboration between China and Russia in infrastructure projects has not only strengthened their economic ties, but also provided Russia with the necessary support to maintain its trade operations amidst global challenges. In the energy sector, China's really ramped up its imports of Russian crude oil lately, and it's a big deal. In 2023, China imported a record 2.1 million barrels per day of crude oil from Russia. That's a huge chunk of their total oil imports, about 19%. What makes this even more interesting is that Russia's been offering this oil at discounted prices, thanks to the sanctions and price caps imposed by the G7. Beijing has taken its own path and ignored the international community, seeing this as an opportunity to build up its oil reserves. It's safe to say that Chinese refiners are taking full advantage of these lower prices to cut costs and improve their refining margins. You can't blame them, though. For the country that imports the most crude oil in the world, the discounts on Russian oil make it an attractive option for China, even as they continue to get oil from other places like Saudi Arabia and the United States. By doing this, China not only ensures a stable supply of oil, but also helps support Russia's economy during these tough times with sanctions. What all this shows us is that Russia can't really afford a trade war with China right now. The economic impact would simply be too huge to bear. China wouldn't want to sour their economic ties, as they're benefiting a lot. China's firmly Russia's biggest trading partner, with trade reaching $240 billion in just last year alone. Any issues in this relationship would affect China, but they hit the Russian economy like a truck. That's why this recent 55% tariff on Chinese furniture parts has already caused problems and raised concerns among Russian business leaders, and most fear souring the relations. Moreover, Russia's economy is already under a lot of pressure due to the sanctions and the ongoing conflict. A trade war with China would make things worse, isolating Russia even more from global markets and making it harder to get the resources and technology it needs. While Russia is trying to build trade relationships with other countries like India and Turkey, these efforts haven't made up for the loss of trade with Western countries. A trade war would also hurt the strong partnership Russia's been building with China. They've been working together in areas like energy, defense, and infrastructure. Starting a trade war would needlessly damage this cooperation and the trust between the two nations. This intertwined relationship is a perfect example of how geopolitics and economics often go hand in hand. So with all this said, what does the future hold for Russia-China trade relations? Well, experts have varied opinions. Some predict a cooling-off period, where both nations reevaluate their strategies and work towards resolving the budding tensions. Others foresee continued tensions that might lead to more significant trade barriers and economic repercussions. To resolve this issue, both countries might need to engage in negotiations to find a compromise before things escalate any further. These steps they might choose to take are likely to involve options like revising the tariff rates, agreeing on trade quotas, or implementing joint economic projects to balance the interests of both parties. The path forward will likely involve a combination of diplomacy, economic strategy, and a willingness to find common ground. For now, the situation remains fluid, and only time will reveal the long-term outcomes as both countries play their next cards. But we want to hear from you. What do you think about these developments? How do you see these new tariffs impacting Sino-Russian relations and global trade as a whole? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your insights. We've got more exciting content coming up on global trade, geopolitics, and much more. Join our community and be part of the conversation. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
China's stock market is collapsing. One of its benchmark stock indexes, the CSI 300, is down nearly 40% since its peak in 2021. This index measures the value of China's 300 biggest publicly traded companies, and currently it sits at a 5-year low. Tencent has lost 60% of its stock price, and that's China's biggest company by market capitalization. In just 3 years, all Chinese stocks combined have lost $6 trillion in market value. That's more than the economy of any other country except for the US and China. Now, this may not seem all that important for outsiders, but actually it's a symptom of a wider economic downturn. As the value of Chinese businesses is dropping, China's economy is clearly not doing well, and people are starting to lose confidence. This is bad for the CCP, especially because this is not happening in the United States. The benchmark index of the USA, the S&P 500, is actually doing quite well at the moment. It represents America's 500 most valuable public companies. After a year-long downturn in 2022, the index has been rallying ever since. So, China is underperforming as compared to its rival and the rest of the world. This has earned it the title of the worst stock market in 2023. For the CCP, this is bad for its reputation, both at home and abroad. And it also raises some eyebrows when we look at China's GDP numbers. According to the CCP, the Chinese economy grew 5.2% in 2023. That is still low for Chinese standards, but there's a huge disconnect. The authorities say that China's economy continues to grow, while the markets say that it's absolutely collapsing. With a little common sense, it's easy to see what's happening. The CCP is trying to spread a false narrative about its economy to remain in power. And that's why it's currently censoring any negative takes on China's economy on the internet. In this video, we'll uncover what's truly going on with China's stock market and the underlying economy. As you'll see, China's once successful experiment with the free market might be coming to an end. Let's start with the economy, as the stock market and the economy go hand in hand. So, the GDP numbers from the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics might give us a wrong picture about the economy. But first of all, we need to look at the shenanigans happening inside of the Chinese stock market. You see, at least a part of China's stock market is also fake. In 2019, over 50% of China's stocks were owned by institutional investors, and this number is on the rise. Institutional investors are organizations like banks, mutual funds, pensions, or insurance providers. They buy stocks to grow their capital. These kinds of investors also have a huge share of the United States stock market. But there's one key difference. In China, the CCP has a lot of influence over these institutions. Last year, Xi Jinping announced a new financial regulatory body called the National Financial Regulatory Administration. This organization centralizes the CCP's control over the financial sector. Basically, Xi Jinping wants the banks to put capital where the CCP needs it, putting an end to free market times. By pouring capital into the stock market, the CCP is already artificially keeping the prices up to fight the market crash. According to the Swiss UBS Bank, Chinese-backed funds have already bought $57 billion worth of stocks this year. The CCP-owned China Investment Corporation plans to continue pumping up the prices on the market. But most importantly, all of these non-CCP banks might also be influenced. With the new regulatory body, Chinese banks aren't allowed to hurt the CCP's political goals. Right now, that goal is to create an image of a strong Chinese economy. This is why China's institutional investors might not sell as many stocks as they would want to. Still, it's not hard to see how this won't work. There's a reason for the huge sell-off. Chinese companies earning less revenue and profits than they used to. Keeping the price up will create a bubble, which can only last so long. But Xi Jinping doesn't blame himself for the financial trouble. Instead, he points the finger at the bankers. Right now, he is cracking down on the hedonistic bankers that don't align with the CCP's goals. They've received huge pay cuts, and bonuses were slashed by 60%. Recently, China's anti-corruption agency released a warning to the financial industry. It would seriously investigate and deal with the people who neglect the party's leadership in financial work and state-owned enterprises. It also said that bankers should stop having a singular focus on money, like in the West, and that they shouldn't form a financial elite. So, something that the CCP really hates is short selling. Basically, short selling is where you make money when a price of a stock goes down, through complex contracts. The Chinese Securities Regulatory Commission said it had zero tolerance for short sellers and that they would lose their shirts and rot in jail. Now, to be fair, there's definitely a point to be made against some bad financial practices. After all, we only have to look at the 2008 financial crisis to see how things can really go wrong. However, that's not completely what's going on here. In reality, the CCP is doing this to game its financial sector. Because the party can fire bankers at any point on the basis of degeneracy, it basically owns them. Going back to the stock market, this has some big effects. As the banks and funds aren't allowed to hurt the CCP's image, the real stock collapse might be even bigger. Even with the CCP's efforts, though, the stock market is still in a downward spiral. This is because retail and foreign investors are selling off their Chinese stocks en masse. There's something fundamental that the CCP can't cheat its way out of: an economic downturn. The earnings of companies on the Chinese MSCI index fell for 4 straight quarters. Apple, which recently posted its first yearly increase in earnings, had one weak spot: the Chinese market. Where the rest of the world had steady growth, Apple's revenue in China declined by 13%. In general, the Chinese economy has never really recovered from the COVID pandemic. Other nations have seen a rebound since the lockdowns due to huge stimulus programs. Consumer spending increased so much that there was even an inflationary crisis all over the world. But in China, well, the opposite happened. It's now in a crisis of deflation. That may sound unfamiliar to many, because the United States last experienced deflation back in 2007 and 2008. It is the opposite of inflation, meaning that prices go down over time. This may sound nice for the consumers, but it's terrible for the economy. Consumers will delay their purchases, meaning that revenues of companies will go down. Let's say you've been saving up to buy a new car. If you know the price is going to drop in the future, you may decide to just wait a while. But if everybody does this, car dealers and manufacturers have a big problem. This applies for every other industry as well. And as a result, the entire economy slows with rising unemployment and declining investments. For China, this is a real risk, as deflation is increasing at alarming speeds. In January of 2024, consumer prices in China declined at their fastest pace in 14 years. But actually, this isn't what's plaguing the Chinese economy the most. If we dig a little deeper, we find another core problem. The deflation is related to something called the debt deflation spiral. Because of problems in China's financial industry, credit is drying up. This is the root cause for the decline in spending and, in turn, the increase in deflation. And as the financial sector and spending are related to the stock market, these problems also lay the basis for the stock market's collapse. So let's dive a little deeper into what's happening with this debt deflation spiral, shall we? Now, you may think that the debt problem in the United States is getting pretty bad, but then you haven't seen what's happening in China. Washington holds about 120% of its GDP in government debt. In China, this debt to GDP ratio is a whopping 280%. It's not the government in Beijing that issued these debts, as the central government holds only 1/14 of the debt pile. The bulk of it is held by local governments. During the last 15 years, they founded many local government financial vehicles called LGFVs. These are local government enterprises that prop up the economy. In 2022, there were almost 3,000 of them. They held about 80 trillion yuan, or $11 trillion, in debts. To put that into perspective, we're talking about approximately half of China's GDP in liabilities. In total, state-owned enterprises held 2/3 of corporate debt. More than 60% of this debt was in the form of bank loans. The problem is that most of these LGFVs aren't able to repay their loans. A third of them don't have a positive cash flow, and 60% struggle to pay their interest with their own earnings. Without support from the local governments, many of these companies wouldn't have existed in the first place. So this begs the question, how much of China's GDP is actually real? Another problem is the huge bubble of non-performing loans that this has created. After all, who's going to pay for the $11 trillion in debt? Last year, Xi Jinping ordered state banks to restructure LGFV debts at lower interest rates. But of course, he has a price to pay for this. All of these bad loans hurt the Chinese economy because there's less capital to invest in actually profitable businesses. The same is true when we look at its real estate crisis. Over the last few years, China's real estate sector has turned into a huge debt bubble. This is a big deal, as Chinese property is the single biggest asset class in the world. It's gotten so bad that the CCP is pushing banks to provide $446 billion to property developers. 50 of them are on the brink of financial collapse, including infamous companies like Country Garden. They've run huge Ponzi schemes which came crashing down from 2020 onwards. Basically, the developers bought land and sold houses that they haven't built yet. With the money they received, they bought more land and then just did exactly the same thing. In 2019 and 2020, 90% of properties were sold with this pre-sale model. This led to huge liabilities on the developer side, with Country Garden and Evergrande holding more than $500 billion of them. This was made possible by corruption, but also because local governments needed to meet GDP goals. At its peak, the real estate market made up 25 to 30% of GDP. Because it was one of the key drivers of growth, local governments turned a blind eye to the Ponzi schemes. And initially, people weren't worried about the possible debt bubble. There was incredible demand for housing, and people thought prices would only go up. In early 2019, the price for a new house increased more than 10% year on year. Approximately 70% of Chinese household wealth was stored in real estate, and buying a house was very popular. The developers thought that their debts were no big deal, as housing sales would just continue. But now, the sector is in turmoil. The recent collapse of the property giant Evergrande shows that the real estate boom didn't last forever. In 2020, the CCP intervened to stop the debt bubble from growing. It limited the pre-sale housing model, and banks stopped financing the property developers. Together with a slowdown in housing sales, this was the last straw. In 2021, Evergrande began to miss interest payments on $300 billion of its debts. After a period of battles with debt holders, Evergrande was finally liquidated earlier this year. Many fear that other property developers will follow in its footsteps. Now, you may be asking yourself what the local governments and property developers have to do with the stock market. But in fact, the LGFV and real estate crisis are some of the biggest reasons for the collapse. First of all, we have to look at the financial sector. China's economic growth of the past decades has been fueled by lending, which allows massive investments into businesses and infrastructure. And not just a little bit. In China, investment makes up 42% of GDP, which is heavily dependent on credit. Between 2007 and 2016, China's credit grew 18.1% annually, faster than the economy itself. Right now, China's financial system holds $53 trillion in assets, more than half of the size of the world economy. To put that in comparison, US banks only hold $30 trillion in assets. So the credit growth caused the pile of assets in China's banks to balloon. But this Chinese credit machine is coming to an end. Chinese banks have to deal with a massive increase in non-performing loans. Basically, money that they've lent and they're not getting back. Some analysts say that it ranges in the trillions of dollars, although the official figures are much lower. The insane amount of borrowing has backfired, because many loans weren't really even viable in the first place. Apart from raising the risk of bank insolvencies, this also means that overall spending will slow as credit dries up. The bad debts show that China's financial system can't keep expanding forever. We can already see this in China's outside investments. But as you can see on this chart from Boston University, it looks like China's Belt and Road Initiative funds have fallen off a cliff. Many of the $1 trillion already planned projects have also been canceled. The same happened with China's holdings of US debts, which dropped 40% to a 14-year low. This all shows that Chinese funds and banks need the money at home. What's even worse is that this financial turmoil results in deflation. Banks giving out less loans means there's less money available. Using basic supply and demand economics, this causes prices to go down. But there's a catch. This can spiral out of control. During a period of deflation, the real value of debt increases because the value of money goes up. In simpler terms, businesses with debt carry a load that just keeps on getting heavier. Eventually, this can lead to the collapse of these businesses because it's hard to stay afloat with that much weight on top of you. In turn, this leads to even more non-performing loans, less lending by banks, and more deflation. The stock market is anticipating something like this because it thinks that the Chinese economy is heading for a debt deflation loop. It's like a domino effect. One problem leads to another, and the whole market feels the impact. Before talking about the next effect, I need to ask for something. Because bad news about China's economy often gets censored, this video won't get far in the algorithm without your support. By leaving a like down below, you help us tremendously. Alright, without further ado, let's get back to the basics. These problems in China's financial sector also have a huge effect on the confidence in China's economy. To understand this, we have to look at the price-to-earnings ratio on the Chinese stock market. This is the price of the stocks divided by the earnings of the underlying companies. For overall confidence, these numbers are very telling. The higher the price-to-earnings ratio, the more expensive the companies are, and the more trust there is in the future. After all, you only pay a higher price if you think the businesses are about to grow. When the price-to-earnings ratios go down, well, it's the exact opposite. People think growth is coming to an end, and they pay lower prices for companies. That's exactly what happened in China, as we can see on this chart from JP Morgan. In 2021, the price-to-earnings ratios peaked at 19, so stocks were 19 times their underlying earnings. At the start of 2024, however, the stock prices were only 9 times their underlying earnings. So the price-to-earnings ratios were down more than 50%. In other words, trust in the future was cut in half. We can see the same development in the price-to-book ratio. This is the price of companies compared to their book value, the money they're worth if they sell off all their assets. You can think of this as their net worth. In the United States, stocks are worth 4 to 5 times as much as their book values. That means companies are expected to grow in value and not go bankrupt. In China, however, the price-to-book ratio is only 1.7, dropping to a 5-year low. So the data are clear. People don't have confidence in Chinese businesses anymore. This is also true for foreign investors. For years, banks and investment funds invested a lot of capital into the Chinese economy because of its growth miracle. In 2021, foreign direct investment peaked at more than $300 billion. But now, the country has the first outflow of foreign direct investment in 25 years. As you can see on this chart, it reached negative $11.8 billion in the third quarter of 2023. Last January, the outflow in the stock market reached more than $2 billion. This is the longest and strongest outflow of foreign capital since 2014. The debt deflation spiral is obviously one of the biggest reasons for the lack of confidence. But we also have to talk about the increased geopolitical risks. Because China and the United States are competing for power, there has been an economic face-off. This began to gain steam during the Trump administration, where he placed many sanctions on CCP entities and put import tariffs on Chinese goods. His argument was that the massive trade deficit with China, which reached $418 billion in 2018, was hurting the American economy. In the following trade war, the United States and China increased tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade. US President Joe Biden left the tariffs on $350 billion worth of Chinese goods. In the area of technology, he even escalated the trade war. The United States has tried to cut China off of technological developments by limiting its chip access. There are just a few American, Dutch, and Japanese companies that control the advanced chip supply chain. All of these companies are not allowed anymore to sell their most advanced products to China. For example, NVIDIA can't sell its most advanced AI chips to the Chinese market. China's own chip companies are several years behind the Western ones. So this is a huge obstacle for its technological progress. And there are fears that the geopolitical turmoil could get even worse. There's a real chance that China invades Taiwan in the near future. A US general predicts that this could happen as soon as next year. Xi Jinping is already 70 years old, and he may want to reunify China before he passes away. If the situation around Taiwan escalates, the trade war between the United States and China will obviously worsen. Washington and its allies could adopt the same strategy as Russia, namely to cut China off from world trade. But the thing is this: that's already happening to some extent. As the relation between Washington and Beijing worsened, companies started to diversify out of China. The new Apple manufacturing plant in India is an example of this. Because of these geopolitical developments, China is slowly losing its position as the world's manufacturing powerhouse. This also has its effect on the stock market, as the future of China looks a whole lot less bright. But the fact that the stock market shows all of this also has political consequences. It's not hard to see why the Chinese Communist Party and the stock market aren't a match made in heaven. The stock market is one of the hallmarks of capitalism, and that's something China isn't very comfortable with. Or is it? Starting in 1978, the country started to implement free market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. He created special economic zones, which don't have a planned economy. As we all know, this was highly successful. Millions of Chinese moved from rural areas to the cities, and real wages exploded, as you can see on this chart. Although the CCP still likes to classify China's economy as developing, it's really a developed one already. GDP growth was in the double digits for years, and China has risen on the global economic leaderboard. Where it was the 7th biggest in real GDP in 1980, it quickly became second, overtaking Japan. It went from a GDP of $396 billion to almost $20 trillion, a 50-fold increase. The reason for this was quite simple. China had something to offer the world's free markets. It had an abundance of cheap labor, so could outcompete anyone in the field of manufacturing. Although the Chinese government was still communist in name, it increasingly adopted capitalist ideas. The Shanghai Stock Exchange, which was first opened in 1866, was reopened in 1990. In 1993, the CCP went as far as to amend its constitution and to create a socialist market economy system. It's basically capitalism with a lot of wiggle room for government influence. This marked the end of China's Maoist period, with the disastrous Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. But when Xi Jinping rose to power in 2013, things started to change. Where his predecessors liberalized and decentralized the country, he did the exact opposite. By removing the term limits for the presidency in 2018, Xi Jinping has practically become China's supreme leader for life. This has also had its effects on the economy. Xi sees the free market economy as a huge threat to his power, which is why he may be ending the capitalist experiment. He doesn't see the private sector as something on its own, but as something to serve the CCP's goals. The party wants to cultivate a team of private economic persons who are resolute in walking with the party. If you phrase this a little differently, it wants private enterprises to do what the CCP says. To achieve this, it has established CCP bodies in many of China's companies. 92% of China's top 500 companies have these bodies, a number that has been on the rise during Xi's presidency. To further solidify his rule over the private sector, Xi Jinping has also been cracking down on many of China's entrepreneurs. In the last few years, China has arrested multiple prominent businessmen, including Jack Ma. Xi Jinping says this is to fight corruption, but many experts think it's something different. The Chinese president wants the most powerful citizens to know who's in charge. With these political changes in mind, we can look at the possible reactions of the CCP to the stock market collapse. For Xi Jinping, it's both a huge threat and a giant opportunity. On the one hand, it reveals that he failed with his economic policies. The reason why the Chinese put up with Xi's power grab is that he provides stability, prosperity, and growth. As the stock market shows, the situation is now the exact opposite. This could result in him losing support. But if Xi Jinping plays his cards right, he can also benefit from the current stock market crisis. He can just point the finger at the private sector, as he already does to some extent. This gives him a reason to return to a centralized economy, giving him even more power. All in all, the stock market shows a very interesting story.
As Russia continues to experience losses in the Russo-Ukrainian war, China is ready to take advantage of the situation and grab back its prized land, Manchuria. Everybody is convinced that China is gunning for Taiwan next, but in a little bit, you're going to see things differently. A lot of you are probably hearing about Manchuria for the first time and have a lot of questions about this specific territory and why it's so important to China. This contention is a piece of a bigger puzzle that many of us are not privy to. Our knowledge of world history is limited to the 2000s, and because we don't know how far these tensions go, we don't understand the now. In a video like this, we are exposing the CCP's schemes, and as you can expect, they are not very happy about this. CCP bots are constantly under our videos every day, trying to downvote them and push them back. To keep our content circulating, please give this video a like and share it with your friends and family. Before China and Russia were even a thing, there was Manchuria, with its earliest known inhabitants being a Mongolic tribe. They were a nomadic group of people who many believe were the ancestors of the Manchu people. Imperialism grabbed hold of the world, and Manchuria was initially conquered by the three kingdoms of Korea. In the 12th century, Genghis Khan took over Manchuria and incorporated it into the Mongol Empire. We remember Genghis Khan, right? He was the emperor of one of the biggest empires in the world, and one of the most feared leaders of the 12th century. This empire that he built included northern China, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. That is basically the whole of Asia today. If you have heard about him, it's probably in line with his brutal policy of massacres and the enslavement of the people he conquered. But as with all ambitious imperial movements, that time came to an end, and then the Qing dynasty began its reign of Manchuria between 1644 and 1912. The Qing dynasty actually came from the Manchu people, who set up Manchuria as their power base. The economic growth that came from that time in the area of agriculture and trade really set up China, and between 1736 and 1796, the empire began to expand to Tibet and Mongolia. Unfortunately, things began to sour for China between 1839 and 1949, and history remembers that period as the century of humiliation. During the 110-year period, everything China had built began to crumble, and all the other foreign nations began to divide China's territories amongst each other. It all started with the Opium Wars that opened China's markets. And then rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion in 1842 and the Boxer Rebellion in 1899 weakened the Chinese Empire. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 was one of the biggest blows, and China lost Korea and Taiwan after that war. As all this went down, Russia was watching as everyone tore at China and took the opportunity to take a piece for itself. The reason it did this was because it was still reeling from the Mongol conquest that tried to take it in the 13th century, so this was the opportunity for it to hit back. During the century, Britain took Hong Kong and the Japanese conquered Taiwan and Manchuria. Even in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party rose to power, it was still bound to unequal treaties that it had signed during its season of desperation. The Russian Empire seized the opportunity by lining up tens of thousands of its troops on the border with China and demanded that the king cede a huge piece of its land that was then known as Outer Manchuria, and they first signed the Treaty of Aigun in 1858. This treaty gave Russia control of the Amur River, the territory east of the Ussuri River and the Sea of Okhotsk River. After that, China was cut again by the next treaty in 1860, called the Convention of Peking, in which China surrendered a piece of territory that was the size of Ukraine. This region included the Primorsky Kai territory and the Khabarovsk territory, which is a large chunk of Manchuria today. If you are looking for the moment that changed Sino-Russian relations forever, this was it. This 1860 treaty that China signed under duress locked China out of access to the Sea of Japan and instead restricted it to the East and South China Sea. Many Chinese nationalists have not forgotten this injustice and have always believed that Outer Manchuria belongs to China. In 1904, China's irritation with Russia increased when it lost Manchuria to Japan. China then lost control of the whole of Manchuria in 1931 till 1945, when Japan also invaded China. Post-Second World War, the Chinese Communist Party set itself up, and the Sino-Russian conflict began. China tried its best to fix things with Russia, and in 1963, it proposed to the Russian government that they should revisit their unequal treaty and resolve their border dispute issue. Unfortunately, the Soviet side was not hearing it. The USSR refused to acknowledge the existence of the border dispute and insisted that the past treaties were equal. Mao Zedong was not happy about this, and in 1964, during a dialogue with Sasaki Kozo and others from the Japanese Socialist Party in Beijing, he said that he felt that the Soviet occupation of Manchuria was too wide and that Russia should not have control of Lake Baikal, such as Khabarovsk, Vladivostok, and the Kamchatka Peninsula. Unfortunately for Mao, these comments leaked, and Moscow was outraged by everything that Mao had said. The tensions began to rise, and China started to manipulate its ideological differences with Russia to start up some trouble. This led to the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969 along the Amur and Ussuri rivers, which was along the boundary of Outer Manchuria. In March of 1969, China claimed an island on Russia's side of the Ussuri River known as Damansky, and hundreds of Chinese and Soviet troops battled against each other for control over the island, with mass casualties being reported. Yuri Sologub, a Russian soldier, recalled how serious the fight got. 18 combat vehicles fired a salvo, and 720 100-kilogram artillery rockets were launched towards the target in a matter of just a few minutes. When the smoke cleared, everyone saw that not a single shell hit the island. All 720 rockets flew 5 to 7 kilometers further, deep into Chinese territory, and smashed the village with all the headquarters, rear services, and hospitals with everything that was there at the time. That is why everything went so quiet. The Chinese did not expect such impudence from us. Moscow was confused by how big the battle was getting, considering that it was allegedly over a small island. Over 500,000 Chinese soldiers were deployed near their border, and Russia began to believe that this fight had to do with the comments Mao made in 1964. Luckily, the crisis never came to war, and the border was officially demarcated in 1991 when the two countries' militaries withdrew. Both countries seemed to reach an agreement, and China even got Damansky Island, but China still felt like it should have gotten the whole of Manchuria back. It is very clear that it has carried over these feelings to the present day. Have we ever considered why China still refers to the territories as Outer Manchuria? It is because even though the territory has Russian names, with cities like Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, China still believes that this is Chinese territory. In any case, despite these underlying issues, Sino-Russian relations got significantly better after 1991. The two countries had already begun to improve their diplomatic relationships, and in 1989, Mikhail S. Gorbachev visited Beijing to seal the reconciliation between the two communist nations. In 1994, the then Russian President Boris Yeltsin returned the favor and visited China too. After his meeting, he proposed extending the free trade zone around the border area and expressed that he was happy that things were getting better between the two countries. From 1996 to 2001, they moved from a strategic partnership to a friendship. In 1996, China and Russia signed the Strategic Partnership Agreement, and Russia stood behind China politically when it was pushing its One China agenda. In 2001, they signed the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, which was a 20-year strategy signed by Chinese President Jiang Zemin and Russian President Vladimir Putin. It broadly laid out agreements for cooperation and geopolitical assistance. But Article 9 of the agreement deserves attention. Article 9 of the treaty was basically a defense impact, which stated that when a situation arose in which the peace of one of the contracting parties was threatened or there were threats of aggression, the two countries would meet immediately to hold consultations to determine how to, quote-unquote, eliminate such threats. On June 28, 2021, the treaty was renewed for another 5 years, and since then, China and Russia have signed a lot of other agreements. In 2022, when President Xi and Putin met on the sideline of the Beijing Olympics, Xi declared that their partnership had no limits, and China agreed to stand with Russia against NATO's alleged aggression. The partnership between the two leaders had gotten so close that Western intelligence reports indicate that Chinese officials knew in early February about Russia's planned invasion and asked Russia to wait until after the Beijing Olympics had finished before beginning. As you guys have seen, we are trying our best to up the production value on the channel. We want to make more of these types of videos and aim to do even better. These videos take a lot of time and thousands of dollars to make, but often they cover topics that are not advertiser friendly, and that's why YouTube often demonetizes our videos. As you can see on your screen, a demonetized video makes very little money compared to what it costs. But we want to continue covering topics like this one even if advertisers don't like it. We like doing it, and hopefully you guys like watching. That's why we have opened up a Patreon and membership. That way you can support our content directly and help us continue doing what we love. So if you are able to, you can support us by joining our Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. QR codes are on the screen and links are in the description. Your support is greatly appreciated. Maybe for the good faith of the relationship, China could forget about Manchuria, right? Well, the truth is that this is not a possibility for a number of reasons. Manchuria's strategic location is one of the reasons why China is hell-bent on fighting to get it back. This is because Manchuria would grant China proximity to Japan and the Korean Peninsula. For a moment, let us think about the increased US military presence in and around South Korea and Japan. Having Manchuria is ideal for China because it counters US influence in the area and allows China to build economic relations in the region. It also gives China back its long-lost access to the Sea of Japan and the Pacific Ocean, which fits into China's expansionist agenda. We hinted at it in the history, but we need to talk about how rich and profitable the Manchurian region is. In Daqing and Songliao, there is major production of oil and gas, which are significant contributors to China's energy production. Mineral resources like coal and iron are also a big part of the wealth in the southwest, where there is a large colliery at Fushun and a large steel mill at Anshan. Other minerals like magnesite, copper, lead, and zinc are found in Manchuria, with reports that uranium and gold deposits being found too. Agriculture is also a big part of Manchuria's economy, and the Great Manchurian Plain that crosses the Liao and Songhua rivers is fertile and densely populated and has become the agricultural center of China. Sweet potatoes, beans, cereals like rice, wheat, and millet, cotton, flax, and sugar beets are the primary crops grown in the region, and China produces enough of these to export. Another important feature that Manchuria has going for it is its rail network that connects China, Japan, North Korea, and Russia. South Manchuria Railway Company was established in 1906 with the purpose of connecting Changchun and Dalian, which was a major port city. From there, the railway expanded and was connected to the Chinese Eastern Railway, which was built by Russia. The railway was used for the transportation of goods in these early days, especially soybeans, which were a major export for Manchuria. This network was a game changer for economic growth and trade in the region, and it also became a big part of expanding coal mining and steel production industries for China. The problem that China has is that parts of this railway still belong to Russia. The Russia Far Eastern Railway is still connected to the Chinese railway network, meaning that it benefits from this logistical masterpiece. Although they have had some joint agreements to connect Russia's Rast Eastern Federal District to China's Heilongjiang, the railway is a source of competition between the two countries. Russia is continuously trying to maintain control of market share, and China is trying to cut its access off. From an economic and logistics perspective, China has a lot to gain from pushing for full control of the territory. About 10% of China's GDP is accounted for by Manchuria's production, which is quite a large chunk. Russia has tried to make the region one where both countries get to eat, but China is fighting for full control. China is not looking to see Russia prosper, especially considering what Putin has been doing in recent years. As a border region, Manchuria has great military significance, with the PLA setting up quite a number of bases in the territory. Harbin, which is a major city in the Heilongjiang region, is the headquarters for military activity in the region. The Harbin Jiayao Air Base hosts the PLA Air Force's 30th Fighter Division, and the Harbin Radar Station monitors the airspace and detects missiles. It was very important to China for it to set up military infrastructure in the region because of how close it is to well-known military heavyweights. The investment that China has put into fortifying the area is proof of a long-term plan that China has to branch out into Russia's share of the area. We have talked about all these features of Manchuria to show why it is lucrative for China, but the reason that Beijing is willing to go to war for Manchuria is largely sentimental. China is coming for every single country that kicked it when it was down, and it hasn't forgotten what Russia did during the century of humiliation. From a nationalist perspective, most of the people in Manchuria are Chinese who speak the language and are a part of the culture. Russia's claim over the region is purely based on what China deems as quote-unquote unequal treaties, and China wants to use this opportunity that the Ukrainian war has given to rewrite these historical wrongs. On the face of it, Sino-Russian relations are doing a-okay, but we need to remember one thing. In geopolitics, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Currently, China and Russia interests are aligning, and they are simply riding the wave of their quote-unquote friendship. Earlier on, we spoke about the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation, but China and Russia have bound each other by so many more strategic agreements. After the renewal of their friendship agreement in 2021, China and Russia signed energy cooperation agreements that included oil and gas contracts for joint energy projects. In 2022, the two countries released a joint statement expressing that they were entering a new era of global sustainable development. One of the important outcomes of the discussions was the positive talks about plans for development of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, with the aim being to intensify cooperation between the EAEU and China. Both China and Russia share a dream for greater Eurasian partnership that works together with the Belt and Road construction, which we will get into later. Russia also made it a point to reaffirm its support of the One China policy and boldly declared that Taiwan was an inalienable part of China and opposed its declaration of independence. Both nations also indirectly condemned Japan and the US, stating that the external forces that were meddling in the region were undermining the security of China. The two countries also used this moment to call out NATO loud and clear. The statement read, "The sides oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on the North Atlantic allegiance to abandon its ideologized Cold War approaches, to respect the sovereignty, security, and interests of other countries, the diversity of their civilizational, cultural, and historical backgrounds, and to exercise a fair and objective attitude towards the peaceful developments of other states. The sides stand against the formation of closed-block structures and opposing camps in the Asia-Pacific region, and remain highly vigilant about the negative impact of the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy on peace and stability in the region." Like Russia, China believes that America is a bully and NATO is the lapdog that does all its dirty work, but it also has a personal vendetta from 1999. China holds a very strong grudge against NATO because of something that happened in 1999. NATO was working to fight against Serbian aggression towards Albanians and dropped a B-2 bomber on the Chinese embassy on May 7th. Dropping the bomb on the embassy was a mistake, but 3 Chinese nationalists were killed and 20 were injured. China does not believe that this was a simple miscalculation and has always suspected foul play. Since then, the US has been public enemy number 1, and China's foreign policy is very anti-American. Both Xi and Putin crave a redemption story and are driven by a desire to prove themselves as formidable forces in the international community. China's century of humiliation and the collapse of the Soviet Union were embarrassing times for these two countries in the global communities, and they are looking for payback against the Western powers that made them the laughingstock. China and Russia have maintained the quote-unquote us against the world agenda, and even in the midst of most of the world blacklisting Russia, China is still trading with Russia. When it was accused of doing this, China defended itself, stating that it was not selling any lethal arms to Moscow and that all it traded were dual goods. These dual goods are a loophole because they are goods that both civilians and the military can use. According to the Carnegie Endowment think tank, Beijing has exported over $300 million worth of dual-use items to Russia every month. This graph shows that trade between China and Russia has rapidly grown in the past couple of years. In 2023, trade reached a record of $240 billion, which is 64% more than in 2021, and Russian imports from China were $111 billion, and its exports to China were $129 billion. At a meeting in Beijing, Putin confidently stated that Russia uses the yuan for 90% of its trade, instead of the US dollar. Well, with all the economic sanctions Russia is facing, it doesn't have much of a choice. Currently, Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia as China's largest oil supplier, and China has overtaken Germany as Russia's largest trading partner. Their existing relationship as trade partners means that their partnership is quite solid. Where there is money to be made, there are friendships to be built as well. As recently as September 2024, in the middle of everything happening in Ukraine, Russia and China have been carrying out joint military drills. Ocean 202 was a 7-day drill exercise that included military exercises and joint patrols between Russia and China. This is after Xi vowed that the two countries would tighten military cooperation between the two countries. Beijing sent out several warships and about 15 aircraft to Russia's far east coast for Ocean 2024, and the two countries' militaries carried out joint naval drills in the waters near Japan. Washington openly expressed its frustration and fears at the developments, stating how worrying it was that Russia and China were cooperating so closely.
White House says it's still concerned about collaboration between Russia and China after their joint show of force near Alaska. In a first, Chinese bombers joined Russian planes to conduct a patrol together before being intercepted by U.S. and Canadian fighter jets. CNN's Natasha Bertrand has details from the Pentagon.
Russian and Chinese bombers were intercepted by U.S. and Canadian fighter jets off the coast of Alaska on Tuesday, in what marked the first time that Russian and Chinese bombers have operated in this area. And while the bombers did not necessarily come close to the United States or Canada, they stayed roughly 200 miles away from the coastline. It was still a concerning development, according to U.S. officials, because, of course, it showcases just how closely now the Russians and the Chinese are operating together, and the fact that the Chinese are now sending bombers, it appears, to this area, which is known as Alaska's Air Defense Identification Zone. It is still technically international airspace, but any time a foreign entity enters that zone, the U.S. does respond by scrambling jets and intercepting those flights. And so while there was never any risk that was posed to the United States or Canada, according to a statement from NORAD, it is still, important for U.S. officials to be able to show the Chinese and the Russians that they are able to track them and monitor them in real time. And Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he did speak to this. He said that it was not a surprise to the U.S. that this was occurring, because the U.S. was able to monitor these bombers really the entire time that they were in the zone, that air defense identification zone, and even before that. But still, it obviously is a sign of just how closely the Russian and Chinese militaries are cooperating now, and clearly it was also meant as a sign and a show of strength by the Russian and Chinese militaries to convey to the U.S. that they are now working together in an area where the Chinese really have not been present before, in the Arctic, near that air defense identification zone. So something that the U.S. is watching very closely here.
What is even more unusual is how well the two presidents get along. Most foreign relations are fostered for the good of the country, but outside of the shared agenda, the two leaders seem to genuinely like each other. Xi has described Putin as his best friend, and they are often spotted doing things that would be considered a little unconventional for two presidents to do when they meet. This should not come as much of a shock, considering how similar the two leaders are. They share similarities in their ideologies, and both governments are autocratic in nature, with the power being centralized in the hands of the leader. Now, despite this show of chumminess, there are a few things that have made China's true feelings about Russia a bit obvious. At Russia's lowest, when every single ruble counts, China has begun to undercut Russia's oil prices, and there are ongoing disputes about gas prices between the two nations. In its heydays, Russia used to export about 200 billion cubic meters of oil, but due to economic sanctions, it is forced to divert its oil sales to China. Originally, the price for a barrel was $82, but a price cap was placed on Russia's exports, only allowing those who choose to still trade with Russia to pay $60. You would expect that China would be more than happy to pay the cap price, but currently a barrel of Urals crude oil, which is Russia's main blend of oil, is selling at $49.50 a barrel. This is because trade partners like China and India have taken advantage of the sanctions and negotiated for lower prices. This moment has very eerie similarities with what happened centuries ago when Russia took advantage of the weakening Qing dynasty to further its own ambitions. Furthermore, as the Biden administration began to squeeze China for more assistance for Russia, economic cooperation has fallen. It began with Russian businesses complaining that there had been delays in payments with Chinese trading partners and that large sums of money were being suspiciously withheld. All of a sudden, there seemed to be heavy scrutiny of transactions with Russian companies, and the payments were being held back by Chinese state banks. Then, in August 2024, China blindsided Russia by carrying out a massive shutdown of Russian transactions worth billions of yuan. All cross-border payments to China stopped, and the trade volumes fell drastically. China's abrupt 180 had to do with the fact that its alliance with Russia was beginning to cause problems for it. The US made it very clear that if China keeps helping out Russian businesses on the sanctions list, they will be hit with secondary sanctions. China has to think about its economy too, and right now, it cannot afford to be on America's bad side. Many companies in China rely on American and European markets for trade, and there are currently 265 Chinese companies on the US stock exchange, with a total market value of $848 billion. As compliance has tightened in 2024, even import numbers have dropped. Russia's imports from China have fallen more than 1% to $62 billion, and its central bank forecasts the country's total imports dropping globally by 3% in 2024. For the most part, there are no hard feelings, and China is doing business. But the truth is that Xi is becoming irritated with the way Russia is moving. With each new phase in the war, China is afraid that it will be roped into the fight on Russia's side if the West steps in. And it is not in China's best interests to be engaged in a global war right now. Putin has become very self-destructive, and China is afraid that it will go down with it. Xi also realizes that it is in his best interest that Putin stays in power. I mean, he has spent so much time investing in the relationship, and the fall of Putin would mean a disruption in the status quo that would then lead to a new successor who may not be in alignment with China's agenda. To further prove China's hidden agenda against Russia, there are reports that China has been using hackers to spy on the Russian state. We all know that Chinese espionage is at an all-time high, but you would think that its ally would be spared. Chinese hackers have targeted dozens of computers belonging to Russian state agencies and tech companies, and reports are coming out that malicious tools have been implanted. The Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky picked up an unknown plug-wide backdoor and an updated version of cloud sorcerer malware, which was previously used to spy on Russian organizations. The spyware has been previously identified and linked to the Beijing-linked hacking group APT31. Although there is nothing concrete to prove these allegations, the possibility that it could be true is enough to sow distrust. Yes, China's ambition for Manchuria is part of taking back what belongs to it, but it all plays into China's long-term strategy in Northeast Asia. Have you ever heard of China's Belt and Road Initiative? The BRI is a massive plan that China has to link East Asia and Europe through one common transport line. The project is sometimes referred to as the New Silk Road, and it has been central to President Xi's foreign policy, which he launched in 2013. The original Silk Road was a product of China's Han Dynasty. The road was a trade network through present-day Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, India, and Pakistan to the south. This is over 4,000 miles from Europe right now. The road put Central Asia at the epicenter of globalization, and it was at the forefront of connecting Eastern and Western markets together. Through this network, China was able to push valuable Chinese silk, jade, and other goods, while it received gold and other precious metals, ivory, and glass products. In 2013, President Xi set his plan in motion during his official visit to Kazakhstan and Indonesia. He pitched his idea for the New Silk Road, highlighting how profitable it would be for everyone involved. In his speech, he stated, "If our region can realize local currency convertibility and settle under current and capital accounts, it will significantly lower circulation costs, increase our ability to fend off financial risks, and make our region more economically competitive in the world." The plan was to create a Silk Road economic belt and the Maritime Silk Road. Initially, it was referred to as One Belt, One Road Initiative, but eventually it became Belt and Road Initiative. Xi's vision included creating a vast network of railways, energy pipelines, highways, and streamlined border crossings both westward through the mountainous former Soviet republics and southward to Pakistan, India, and the rest of Southeast Asia. After Xi's initial announcement, he announced his plans subsequently at the 2013 summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Indonesia. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a regional grouping amongst 10 members: Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, that aims to promote economic and security cooperation. It was very strategic for Xi to lay out his plan there, and it helped him build his membership to the point that it is today. On top of the rail and road network, China also wanted to expand maritime trade traffic by investing in port development along the Indian Ocean, from Southeast Asia all the way to East Africa and parts of Europe. China's investments have paid off, and as of December 2023, there are 147 countries under the Belt and Road Initiative. This map shows how much of the world is under BRI. Of the 147, 44 countries are in Sub-Saharan Africa, 34 countries are in Europe and Central Asia, 25 countries are in East Asia and Pacific, 22 countries are in Latin America and Caribbean, 19 countries are in the Middle East and North Africa, and 6 countries are in Southeast Asia. This large portion of the world makes up about 2/3 of the world's population and 40% of global GDP. On top of building the infrastructure, China also funded economic zones that went into promoting job employment and bettering the conditions for developing countries. On the front of it, the desire was also to expand the international use of Chinese currency. And while it is undeniable that what China has done has benefited a lot of people from this initiative, there's definitely a hidden agenda behind this for China. The move of this initiative has actually been to assert China more dominantly on the world stage. BRI is basically how China plans to push back against US influence. And at the end of the day, it is about boosting Chinese income, exports, and production capacity. China is basically trying to redraw trade maps the same way that it randomly redraws territorial maps on a regular basis. On this new map, China is the center of trade, not Europe or the US. China is also using its influence in the BRI to streamline its Made in China 2025 project, which is a government plan to grow China's manufacturing base by rapidly developing 10 high-tech industries like electric cars, telecommunications, advanced robotics, and artificial intelligence. The plan has two parts: completely remove China's reliance on foreign markets and create a sort of monopoly for China in global markets. China is also secretly creating leverage for itself. In 2021, a study done on over 100 debt financing contracts revealed that there were clauses in the contracts that takes away the country's ability to work with the Paris Club, which is basically 22 countries in the West. China also has the ability to retain the right to demand repayment at any time, and this is a way that China can force countries to push its agendas or force them to buy into its One China policy. All of this should not come as a surprise at all, considering the fact that no help or assistance is ever freely given. But where does Manchuria play into all of this? Well, Manchuria is basically the heartbeat of China's scheme. Due to its rich resource center, it is economically a big part of the project. BRI projects have included the China-Russia Railway Bridge that has connected Manchuria to Russia and the China-Mongolia-Russia corridor that has enhanced trade for the three nations. From Manchuria, China has pushed to increase trade in Central Asia, Mongolia, and North Korea. We must not kid ourselves into believing that Russia has just been a bystander as all of this has been happening. Economically, Russia benefits from the Belt and Road Initiative, so it has played along and even praised Xi for the initiative. A Russian state news agency quoted Putin saying, "We see that some perceive it as an attempt by the People's Republic of China to crush someone under itself, but we don't see this that way. We just see a desire for cooperation." Putin is not stupid, and he understands that he has to dance for his supper. Underneath the facade of pretending like he's behind China, he sees the problem with the BRI. The Kremlin recognizes that this initiative is in competition with its own Trans-Siberian Railway network and its agenda of connecting its region through rail. The only reason that Russia has piped down on its opposition to the BRI is because China has allowed the linking of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a Russian initiative. Under this initiative, China has accepted that the EAEU will be a full and equal partner to Beijing in the region, as Russia attaches great significance to the EAEU in this section. Even though this concession has been made, Russia still understands that this move by China is a dilution of its influence. The only issue is that it currently is not in a position to fight back, considering its current economic crisis and the effect of the Western sanctions. In relation to China's ambitions for Manchuria, Russia has chosen to play dumb. In a recent interview on a Taiwanese TV program, Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te boldly declared that China was not driven by territorial integrity, but rather by a desire to change the world. He then went on to say that instead of focusing on annexing Taiwan, China needed to focus on the fact that it gave up large tracts of Manchuria to Russia. His argument was that China had more of a claim in Manchuria than it did in Taiwan, and that it should pursue its business there. Russia's immediate response was to make Taiwan's statement seem insane. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova criticized Lai's statement and stated that the claim was absurd, and China and Russia had settled the border in a 2004 agreement. According to Zakharova, Beijing was in agreement with the parts of Manchuria that Russia had ceded. Zakharova even went as far as stating that Lai was, quote-unquote, being pushed towards separatism by the Americans. Russia is supposedly extremely confident in its friendship with Beijing and believes that they are on the same page. It is unclear if Russia is just playing the diplomacy game really well or if it actually believes what it's saying. It would be worrying if Russia is not even anticipating that China may have territorial ambitions in the region. This means that when China eventually does exact its plan for Manchuria, Russia will be blindsided. Well, the rest of the world seems a lot more clued up than Russia is, and that is why the US and NATO have been very intentional about countering China's power. Think about it. The spotlight has currently been on Putin, so we have been unable to see how much of an actual villain China is. China's expansionist tendencies are visible on so many fronts. You have its fights with Taiwan, its issues in the South China Sea, its issues with India along its border, and some scuffles with Japan. The US sees China's BRI initiative as a Trojan horse that China is going to use for its military expansion. To counter the creation of the BRI, in 2021, Biden and the other members of the G7 launched the Build Back Better World Initiative. The aim of its project was to provide an alternative to BRI for middle to low-income countries. It was basically marketing itself as a private school version of the BRI, with goals like investing in clean energy and strengthening health security. Unfortunately, the project has not taken off as well as expected. This is because it did not manage to gather enough funding to actively compete with the BRI. A year after it was launched, the initiative only managed to raise about $6 million. It has undergone a rebrand and is now called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. Both Russia and China have worked hard to paint NATO and the US as aggressive and greedy, but in reality, the whole point of collective defense has been to counter the movement of countries like Russia, North Korea, and China. Outside of the US, two other countries have been able to see China's ambitions for what it is: India and Japan. From the beginning, India has tried to sound the alarm on China's agenda, referring to it as the String of Pearls geoeconomic strategy. According to India, China is trying to establish its network of ports and rail to dominate Asia and push India's dominance in the Indian Ocean. To do this, China creates unsustainable debt burdens for its Indian Ocean neighbors in order to seize control of regional choke points, and it has even gone as far as becoming partners with India's rival, Pakistan. India has been very proactive in fighting against this and has begun to start its own infrastructure projects with neighbors like Afghanistan. The United States has also allied with India because it views it as a counterweight to a China-dominated Asia. Like India, Japan has been balancing its interests as well by developing regional infrastructure development like the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which basically aims to develop a network that connects Myanmar to East Africa. Japan is so committed to this agenda that it has pledged over $300 billion in public and private financing to infrastructure projects throughout Asia. India and Japan have been working together on this project with hopes of countering China's ambitions. Other states that have been critical of China's ambitions include France, which has stated that the alleged partner countries in the BRI are more like vassal states, and that they should be careful about what they are getting themselves into. The international community's fear is that China's ambitions will continue to grow, and imperialism may begin again if countries do not work together to balance out its influence. The next coming months are what will turn supposed conspiracy theorists into analysts. It is not hard to read China, and one thing that is guaranteed is that they are opportunists. Everybody has been convinced that China's first victim in its territorial expansion mission would be Taiwan, but this could not be further from the truth. Diane Francis explains that China's plan for Taiwan was never an invasion, and the agenda was to create a one-country, two-system deal. Unfortunately, now that Taiwan has rejected this, China has moved on to other ambitions. The current geopolitical context makes it the perfect time for China to take Manchuria back. For one, no one in the international community will stand by Russia, and Moscow is in no shape to retaliate. Putin is entering into his 4th year of war soon, which is a bad omen, and China has begun to make it very clear which side it's standing on. Recently at the BRICS summit, President Xi spoke up and stated that there should be no escalation of fighting in Ukraine. He stated that as the crisis drags on, 3 principles need to be kept: no spillover from the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no adding oil to the fire by relevant parties. This was definitely a dig at North Korea that has sent troops into Russia, and it does not help that China is unhappy about the budding relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang. As the Russian ship begins to sink, China has already positioned itself as a neutral party and will be able to benefit from Moscow falling. It has been holding on to this agenda for 200 years, and this is the perfect time for it to take back the land. In her Times radio interview, Diane Francis made it clear that she believes that the Russian Federation will collapse after the war in Ukraine. She added, "China is very much involved in what happens to Russia after this is over. Many of us speculate that once the center doesn't hold and they lose the war, whoever replaces Putin is not going to be able to hold on to 11 time zones of the nation. It is just too big a country. At the far east edge is Manchuria, which was stolen from China over 100 years ago. They want Manchuria back, and they are going to get it." Things have gotten so bad for Russia that it has to rely on assistance from North Korean troops. In October 2024, South Korea reported that North Korean troops were in Ukraine and that about 6 North Korean officers had been killed in a Ukrainian missile strike near Donetsk on October 3rd. Some leaked audio was intercepted by the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, revealing Russian soldiers, raising concerns about how North Korean soldiers will be commanded and provided with ammunition and military kit. There have been differing accounts as to the number of soldiers in Ukraine, but there is no doubt that North Korea is fighting the war on Russia's side. The White House has said that there are at least 3,000 troops, while Ukrainian President Zelensky stated that 10,000 soldiers are being prepared for deployment. This clear escalation by Putin is really just clear proof that the whole war has become a train wreck. China has already begun to position itself to sell out Putin by maintaining that it does not want to be a part of the mess. Adding North Korea into the mix is dangerous, as it proves the belief that there's going to be a Russia, North Korea, Iran, China axis in this war. Chinese officials have already made it clear to Newsweek that Beijing is looking to de-escalate the war, and it is not happy about the reports that North Korean troops have entered the war. In a statement released by Chinese U.S. Embassy, China made it very clear that it hopes that all the parties in the Ukraine crisis are working towards de-escalation, and China is hoping for a political settlement. What does not help the situation even more is the fact that North Korean soldiers have just arrived on the scene, but they are already losing ground. Days after arrival, reports show that 18 North Korean soldiers deserted the Russian front line, and the Russian troops have been looking for them ever since. The troops were deployed to Kursk and were supposed to be part of the agenda to push Ukraine out of the region. Well, what does this mean for China, and how will it carry out its plan to take back Manchuria? China is simply biding its time and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. There is a lot that it has to consider in relation to when and how it strikes. Currently, it has vested interests in Russia, and its economic investments need to be protected. At the same time, its alliance is still beneficial, so it is all about waiting for the right time. Should it wait until Russia is significantly weakened, or strike only once the war is completely ended? All of these things are points to consider as Beijing maps out how it is going to get its territory back. Russia's current frontline losses are increasing, and it is clear that Putin is going to lose this war. It has made some desperate last-ditch attempts, like giving away land to China for equipment and signing military pacts with North Korea for military personnel. Putin is way over his head now, and the war that was only supposed to last a couple of weeks is about to close its third year. China is too smart to go down with Putin, and it has been thinking about how it can leverage its allies' loss for its territorial benefits. By aligning with the countries that are calling for de-escalation, China is preparing for the time when the spoils of war will be divided, and it will be given the opportunity to take back Manchuria once and for all.
Russia and China have been in each other's good graces in recent years, so it might be hard to believe they could be falling out. When the Ukraine war started, everyone assumed that Russia and China would be united forever because of their hatred for the West. But recently, cracks have started to emerge in this friendship. As the famous saying goes, in the game of geopolitics, there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. Only permanent interests. Today, we're going to dive deep into Sino-Russian relations very closely to shine a light on the cracks in the outward expression of friendship. Have you noticed that it's really difficult to find content like this on YouTube lately? Videos like this that discuss geopolitical matters, especially about China and Russia, tend to be drowned out by the YouTube algorithm because foreign bots downvote them to kill their reach. So, if you can, help us out by hitting the like button below. Share it on social media if you think this information's valuable. And now, let's get started. Before we get into the built-up tension between these two giants, let's go back to how relations between the two started. Russia and China were not always political buddies, and in the 60s, they did not see eye to eye. Both countries competed for control over foreign communist states and political movements, and many countries had two rival communist parties that concentrated their fire on each other. To further fuel dissension, in 1969, there was a brief border conflict known as the Sino-Soviet border conflict. It lasted 7 months, and though it was later resolved, it left a bitter taste in the mouths of both nations. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was humbled and began to play nice with everybody else. Under its conciliatory policy, they finally put the border dispute to rest and began to pursue a partnership in the 1990s. In 2001, they signed the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation in Moscow with President Putin and Jiang Zemin. The 20-year treaty covered everything from economics, diplomacy, and geopolitical relations. Interestingly, Article 9 of that clause basically binds the two nations to help each other out in the case of war. It states, when a situation arises in which one of the contracting parties deems that peace is being threatened and undermined, or its security interests are involved, or when it's confronted with the threat of aggression, the contracting party shall immediately hold contacts and consultations in order to eliminate such threats. The treaty also talks about intelligence sharing, and includes a no first use clause that ensures that both parties will not use nuclear force against each other as a first response. This treaty was renewed in 2021, and it seems that the intention is for the two parties to continue to work together. Currently, it seems their allegiance is stronger than ever, and it's alleged that as a favor to China, Russia waited until after the Beijing Olympics ended February 20th to invade Ukraine 4 days later. Western intelligence reports say that senior Chinese officials knew about the invasion prior and called in the favor. We've chronicled their journey to partnership, but now we need to look at why the Sino-Russian alliance has lasted for 2 decades. Understanding their ties will help us determine how strong or weak they are, and that will show us the fault lines behind their falling out. Now, as the saying goes, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. China and Russia's bond is built on their similar feelings towards the West, specifically the US, and this is shown in their foreign policy. Talking about issues between Russia and the US would require us to pause this video and do a completely different one. After all, Russia's been constantly in competition with America for dominance economically, militarily, and in terms of global influence. Due to their well-established rivalry, most nations either align with one or the other, and the lines are drawn pretty clearly. China's always been anti-NATO, so that automatically puts it on the Russian side. This is because China believes that America's a bully and NATO's the lapdog that does all its dirty work. On that note, China holds a very strong grudge against NATO because of something that happened in 1999.
Early hours of Friday, May the 7th, 1999, NATO planes bombed the center of Belgrade and almost risked bringing China into the conflict on the side of the Serbs. 2 rockets hit the Chinese embassy. Damage to any foreign embassy would have been embarrassing enough. Hitting the Chinese building brought a diplomatic nightmare. 3 Chinese journalists were killed by the rockets. 20 more embassy staff were injured, some of them seriously.
NATO was working to fight against Serbian aggression towards Albanians, and dropped a B-2 bomber on the Chinese embassy on May 7. Dropping the bomb on the embassy was a mistake, but 3 Chinese nationals were killed and 20 were injured. China does not believe that this was a simple miscalculation and has always suspected foul play. Since then, the US has always been public enemy number 1, and China's foreign policy is very anti-American. So both Russia and China want to take America down, and they're willing to work together to weaken American power and influence. That factor brings them together. On the military front, Russia and China's patent for aggression makes them the best of friends. Outside of their intelligence sharing, they carry out joint military drills in the seas around Taiwan, working to strengthen their military ties. Furthermore, while China's complied with the request not to sell arms to Russia, China does provide them with dual goods. These are goods that could be used for civilian or military purposes, and it's obvious that China uses this loophole to sell military equipment to Russia. Building on this, over the years, China and Russia have also worked hard to build economic cooperation. In 2007, Russia exported about $5 billion worth of goods and oil to Russia, and in 2019, that number jumped to about $5.7 billion. Even when most of the West hit Russia with sanctions in 2014, China was still one of the few countries that continued to work with Russia economically. Currently, Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia as China's largest oil supplier, and China has overtaken Germany as Russia's largest trading partner. Their existing relationship as trade partners means that their partnership is quite solid. Where there's money to be made, there are friendships to be built as well. What strengthens their bond even more is the similarities that exist between both their ideologies. Both governments are autocratic in nature, and the power is centralized in the hands of the leader. China's a one-party state, and Putin runs a multi-party state that cracks down heavily on any opposition. Looking at their almost identical domestic policies, it's not difficult to see why they would work well together. The cherry on the top for the two parties is that the two leaders actually like each other. That may not seem to matter, but it definitely sweetens interaction. Xi described Putin as his best friend and shared an intimate meal with him in 2018, where they shared Russian pancakes and took vodka shots. For Xi's 66th birthday in 2019, Putin presented him with a cake and a giant box of ice cream, which was an incredibly sweet gesture. Most presidents do not bother meeting up unless they have to, but it's reported that the two have met up over 40 times unofficially. They actually had a long-standing tradition of meeting up for each other's birthday that was only broken by COVID and then the Ukraine war. With such good relations between the two of them, what would cause the tension? Well, let's dive into it then. As you guys know, today's geopolitical world moves very fast, and it's pretty much impossible to keep up with all the news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers world news in a quick and simple way. Every day I send out an email directly to your inbox that covers the most important world news that you can read in less than 5 minutes. Best of all, it's completely free, and you can sign up now by using the link in the comments or link in my bio. Getting back to China and Russia, it can be hard to see it, but we need to remember that not all that glitters is gold. To begin with, there are ongoing disputes about gas prices between the two nations. When most of Europe turned its back on Russia due to its aggressions, China was one of its few economic allies. The intention was for Russia to begin to push some of its oil through a new pipeline known as the Power of Siberia 2. Russia used to export about 200 billion cubic meters in its heydays, and hoped to be able to divert some of its exports to China. Unfortunately, a disagreement about the gas prices has led to a stall in the construction of the pipeline. The two nations have not been able to come to an agreement because China's price point is considerably lower than Russia expected. Due to the sanctions, Russia has lost so much money and is really trying to make up for it here. On the other hand, China knows Russia's desperate and is using that to drive a hard bargain. For now, Russia seems to be staying diplomatic, because it needs to, but it's hard to imagine that it'll forget this squeeze by their ally. If Russia could survive economically without trade in China, we're sure there would be no need for their friendship. But currently, it is a convenience that keeps these two nations joined at the hips. On top of all this, dabbling with Russia is beginning to cause some problems for China. To try and stifle Russia's efforts in Ukraine, the Biden administration has shifted to imposing sanctions on China for aiding Russia. To further squeeze China, the US has added 42 Chinese companies to its sanction list, and Biden threatens secondary sanctions if they continue to support the aggressor. In response to the pushback, Chinese banks have become stricter and are now refusing to help Russia evade sanctions. Chinese banks are refusing to process Russian payments, and this is causing friction between the two nations. Though you'd expect Russia to understand the tricky position it's placed China in, it seems that the Kremlin's disappointed and feels that its allies should help it out. Between China's irritation and Russia's entitlements, this sanction issue has the potential to push the countries further apart as they rush to protect their own interests. Now, although Putin has stated that China is in full support of its actions in Ukraine, other reports show that China may not be in favor of Putin's aggressive policy. China's fearing a looming World War III on the side of the aggressor, which could cause big problems for Beijing. An anonymous source in the Kremlin states that the current Russian leadership has a brewing conflict with the leadership of China. This week, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Russian side once again expressed concern about the reluctance of the Chinese leadership to universally assist in circumventing Western sanctions imposed on Russia. While they have seen eye to eye on most issues, it seems that China's patience for Russia is running out. Russia's destructive and intimidating foreign policy is gaining many enemies, and China may cut ties soon if it doesn't want to go down with the Kremlin. To further sour the relationship, there are reports that China has been using hackers to spy on the Russian state. Chinese hackers have targeted dozens of computers belonging to Russian state agencies and tech companies, and reports are coming out that malicious tools have been implanted. The Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky picked up on an unknown plug-Y backdoor and an updated version of cloud sorcerer malware, which was previously used to spy on Russian organizations. The spyware has previously been identified and linked to the Beijing-linked hacking group APT-31. Although there's nothing concrete to prove these allegations, the possibility that it could be true is enough to sow distrust. It would have been idealistic of any of the parties to completely trust the other, sure, but such reports only work to sow suspicion and push a wedge between the two countries. By the way, do you remember the Sino-Soviet border dispute? Although it seemed to have been resolved, it looks like there's still some unfinished business. On a map published in 2023 by Beijing, the island of Bolshoy Ururisky Island is marked entirely as Chinese territory. This is in violation of their agreement, which splits the island between the two countries, with China controlling the eastern half and Russia controlling the western half. An honest mistake? Probably not. China may have played along for this long, but it has plans to take back what it believes belongs to it. The island, known as Heijiasi Island in Chinese, may seem unimpressive, but its strategic geographical position is important for China. It sits right at the junction of the Amur and Ussuri rivers, which means it's close to Khabarovsk, outer Manchuria. China's uncomfortable with territory so close to one of its largest cities being partially controlled by Russia. Also, Russia controls the portion of the island where the rivers converge, and this means that it has access to shipping routes, which is strategically a bonus. With all these factors considered, it's not hard to see why China would be considering overthrowing the current agreement and taking back the territories that have been allocated between China and Russia. Outside their disputes for territories along their border, Russia and China's interests in Central Asia are a cause for concern. There's currently no friction as they've not come head-to-head, but the competition between the two is underlying. Russia tends to interfere in the politics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, which have sizable ethnic Russian communities and speak the Russian language. In 2022, the Russian military helped the government of Kazakhstan suppress anti-government riots in Kazakhstan's capital, Astana. China's role in the region has been more subtle, and its focus has been on developing infrastructure in Kazakhstan to allow for two-way trade. China's focused on the region economically, and Russia's looking at it for political gain. While there's been no fighting, two superpowers with interests in one region never ends well. We also need to ask ourselves if China's going to need Russia's allyship in the foreseeable future. China's shaping up as a global economic force, and if it continues on this trajectory, there may be very little need for it to continue to play nice with Russia. China's exports have grown substantially, with $89.4 billion worth of goods being pushed to Central Asia in 2023. Russia's current military projects and the hit of the economic sanctions have drained it considerably, and this means that it's lagging behind. If we look at it, China's economy is currently 6 times the size of Russia. China surpassed Russia in nominal per capita GDP in 2020, and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, predicts that China's GDP will reach nearly $30 trillion by 2027, while Russia's GDP is predicted to be well under $2 trillion. Furthermore, according to the SIPRI report, China's military expenditure as of this year sits at $296 billion, whereas Russia's, despite the war, sits at less than half of that at $109 billion. The glaring difference between the two means that Russia and China are no longer equal partners. Economically, Russia's holding on to China for support, and this means Russia needs China more than it needs Russia. Now, I'm not trying to make it seem like China's indestructible and would be completely self-sufficient if it burned its bridges with Russia. Trade is a vital part of both countries' economies, so they'll not be letting go of each other anytime soon. What we are highlighting is that the strings that bind them together are flimsy and could easily be snipped off. If China grows strong enough and wishes to advance its interests around the area of its border with Russia, it would likely do away with the understanding it currently has. We also need to consider that China's military is modernizing, and as it grows economically, it's now in a position to better fund its expansion projects. What's more, Russia's struggles in Ukraine have hinted to us that China is not immortal. The limited capability of its armed forces and the holes in some of its strategies show us a nation that is more aggressive than it is precise. If China were to mount an attack against Russia, it could really be anyone's game. The cracks outlined are still small, and maybe the relations between the two will remain intact for some decades to come. On the other hand, there is the possibility that the cracks will deepen and sever the ties between the two nations. Currently, Sino-Russian interests align, and therefore they'll continue to coexist. However, over time, as interests change and the playing field changes, these two powers could be on opposite ends.
China's real estate market is crashing, and it's bringing the whole economy with it. Property prices have been falling for the last 12 months in a row, and last month was the highest decline in over a decade. The CCP is scrambling, trying anything and everything to stop the freefall. Only time will tell if it's too little too late. Many experts believe that China may be heading for the same fate that Japan faced in the 1990s when its real estate bubble popped. Things got so bad in Japan after the bubble that the economy never recovered for 20 years. A situation like Japan's lost decades is something the CCP cannot afford. So today, let's go over how the CCP got here, what it's doing to help the citizens, and most importantly, are any of the new policies working? Let's start from the beginning. We already have a video on it, but here's a quick recap on how the CCP created this problem in the first place. You see, here in Uncle Sam's America, it's considered an important part of the American dream to own a home. But slowly, it's getting less popular among newer generations to do so because of, well, affordability issues. China, on the other hand, they're different. The importance of owning a house has only gone up in the past couple of decades. Real estate is one of the asset classes that the public trusts more than anything, and real estate ownership has a very important cultural significance for the Chinese people. Families use real estate as a way to plan for their retirement. Guys with real estate are considered attractive choices for marriage. And the amount of real estate you own is directly related to your social status in society. Considering all of this, you can see why real estate prices have continued rising over there. There's a high demand for real estate because of all of these factors. And coupled with incredible price rises in the past, you can see why everyone wants to buy houses. It kind of reminds me of the 2008 US housing market, where everyone wants to buy real estate because real estate prices only go up. The rush to buy houses was so huge that the developers were selling out complexes before even breaking ground for construction. However, even after construction finished, apartments just sat there empty because they had owners but no habitants. Demand was so high because everyone wants to buy their second or third home to get rich on the real estate boom. So supply increased drastically to match the demand, but a lot of these homes were just sitting empty, as owners were only buying these places in hopes of price appreciation. Because other asset sectors weren't as accessible and developed, real estate was the only thing people invested in. Based on one data set, Chinese families had around 70% of their wealth in real estate. Yeah, you heard that right, 70%. Not much for diversification, I suppose. 30% of China's GDP depended on real estate. Imagine if something were to happen to the real estate market.
Evergrande faced liquidity issues as it struggled to meet its debt obligations.
Evergrande is also the world's most indebted developer.
Recently, there has been too much bad news surrounding this name.
The firm has more than 300 billion in liabilities, and it may actually be on the hook for more debt.
Many developers, like Evergrande, took advantage of this boom in China's real estate market and became one of the largest developers in the country. At one point in 2018, they were actually the biggest real estate company in Asia. When people look at something that big, they just assume it's all legitimate. Oftentimes, though, that's just not the case. Hope you guys learned that lesson after the 2008 crisis. If one had just looked under the hood, they would have realized that some of the practices happening at Evergrande were far from appropriate. Now, due to the sheer scale of the company, a lot of practices were quite complicated. But here's my attempt to simplify it. Remember earlier how I mentioned that FOMO into real estate was so bad that people were buying houses before the construction even began? Usually, a company like Evergrande would lease a piece of land from the local government. They would then turn around and sell the houses that are supposed to be built there, and receive full payment for the houses before even breaking ground. Companies would never have any issue selling out as the demand for real estate was just so high. People were more than happy to take out mortgages and buy houses just in hopes of owning real estate someday in the future. Now, the big problem that starts here is that companies like Evergrande wouldn't usually use the money from the sale to start construction. No, they would use that money as down payments to buy even more land, so they can sell even more apartments for the future. Now, this is already a huge problem. This should not have been allowed in the first place. Any unbiased person can look at this system and figure out that this is not going to last. This is exactly the job of the CCP, to regulate the market, but they had passed on this responsibility to the local governments. This is where another problem lies. Local governments were directly benefiting from these real estate pyramid schemes that companies like Evergrande had going on. You see, in China, one of the big ways local governments make money is by leasing land to developers like Evergrande. This meant that the more risk these property developers took on, the higher the bids on the land that the government was leasing out. Around 50% of local government's revenue was coming from leasing out land. The same government that should be protecting its citizens from these risky practices is benefiting heavily from these so-called risky practices. This is a prime example of perverse incentives. We don't even need to get into the corruption that goes on around these land leases. This is one of the main reasons why China's real estate bubble has gotten so big. Regulators were always slow to step in because it was directly benefiting them. The CCP saw where things were heading and tried to get things under control by implementing the 3 red line policies for property developers. But it caused more problems than it solved. You see, the goal of the red lines was to stop the developers from taking on too many loans and becoming over-leveraged. Which sounds like a good idea, until you think about the fact that these developers need the loans to finish the construction projects they had started. Remember how they would pre-sale homes and use the money to buy more land? That meant that loan money was actually being used for construction for apartments and houses the people had paid for already. When the 3 red lines came in, banks became more strict, and that meant developers couldn't get the funds to finish projects. This started the domino effect that is still playing out to this day. Projects were paused, debt payments were missed, and citizens got angry. Once the news hit the global media, people started looking closer at China's real estate bubble. Everyone realized that it was a time bomb, and the CCP's 3 red lines had started the timer. Things were about to get much worse. People found empty, unfinished houses, malls, and cities. That's right, a developer named Greenland actually started building a city full of French mansions in hopes of staying ahead of the growing demands of Chinese buyers. Not one mansion, but a city full of mansions. The Wall Street Journal has a full video on this, and I highly recommend you guys check that out after this video. As funds dried up, the city is now left abandoned and unfinished. Some of these homes people actually prepaid for. This problem is not unique to just the city. Currently, there are over 20 million pre-sold homes in China that are unfinished. Now, we usually cover nations on this channel, where figures are in billions and trillions. So in comparison, 20 million doesn't even sound like a lot until you pause and see that these are homes we're talking about. Even if we assume an average price of $50,000, that's almost $1 trillion in unfinished homes that people have bought. Some people are still being forced to pay their mortgage on these loans, even though they see no hope for their home ever being finished. Even for the world's second biggest economy, that's a lot of money. And that's why we see protest videos like these.
Many homebuyers are desperate. Some have taken to street demonstrations.
Evergrande's collapse triggered protests by homeowners, furious that units they had started paying mortgages for weren't being finished.
Many borrowers have been left in dire straits.
And all signs indicate things will only get worse.
Now, in China, people don't often protest because they know the consequences can be drastic. I'm sure you've heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre, where nothing at all happened in 1989 if you ask the CCP. But when people and families went out on the street to protest the housing situation, even the CCP realized this was a big issue. So they tried saving the free fall of the real estate market. The Beijing government rolled out a bailout package that decreased the interest rates on mortgages and reduced the down payment requirements. The hope was that this would make it easier to get loans and buy new houses. If people started buying houses, then developers will get the funds to finish the projects they had paused. Sounds like a good plan, until, you think about it a little deeper. You know how we talked earlier that people in China were not really buying houses to live in? No, they buy them as investments, in hope that prices will continue going up and their wealth will continue rising. 30% of home sales were just people buying a second house, and 10% of home sales were people buying a third house or more. But they had no reason to believe that prices would fall. In fact, for most people, their entire lives, real estate prices only went up. Now, though, things were different. After the 3 red line policy, the music stopped, and real estate prices had started falling. Even with relaxed mortgage rules, why would anyone want to buy houses as investments after what just happened? Human psychology also only compounded the problem here. As you might already know, we as humans are more afraid of a $100 loss than we are excited about a $100 profit. That's loss aversion for you. This means that even people who can afford to buy real estate don't want to buy because they are more afraid to lose money. Before, real estate was the most reliable investment vehicle in China, and now people see it as the least reliable investment vehicle. So only people buying houses right now are the ones who need a house to live in and can afford it. But that's not really a lot of people. Here, we learn why it's so dangerous to be too dependent on one sector. Remember how I said earlier real estate is the single biggest contributing factor to China's GDP? Well, about that. The economy is great when real estate is great, but now that the real estate market is crashing, the economy as a whole is feeling that pressure too. As people see their real estate portfolio crash and burn, they feel poorer, so they spend less money on discretionary stuff like eating out, shopping, celebrating Xi Jinping's birthday. I'm just kidding about that last one, but hopefully you get the point. Now, in any economy, one man's spending is another man's income. And if people stop spending, that means businesses earn less. So now they have to lay off employees, which in turn makes people now spend less, which in turn hurts more business profits. It's like a dangerous downward spiral that's very hard to stop, even for an authoritative government like the CCP. It wasn't just becoming a real estate crash that was hurting China's economy. It was also deflation. You see, unlike the West, which turned on the money printer to deal with the COVID recession, China went a different route. The real estate market bubble was already popping. The CCP didn't want to print money and fuel that bubble. This led to deflation, which is, as the name implies, the opposite of inflation. Prices are going down instead of going up, which may sound like a good thing to you and me, but for an economy, it's a bad thing. Once everyone is thinking that prices tomorrow will be cheaper than today, then no one wants to spend money to buy stuff because they believe tomorrow they can get it for cheaper. So again, businesses make less profit, they lay off more people, and spending goes down even more because more people are unemployed. This is a bit similar to what happened in Japan in the 1990s, when its real estate bubble popped. Many economists believe China may be heading in the same direction, and if the CCP doesn't fix the problem, things are gonna get ugly quickly. But before we talk about that, let's quickly go over one last policy the CCP just implemented to revive the real estate market. That's giving money to banks and local governments. Earlier this year, the CCP launched Project Whitelist that allows city governments to recommend residential projects to banks as being suitable for financial support. Basically, the CCP is telling banks that they can loan money to some developers so that they can finish paused projects. The project comes at a time when developers do not have the money to repay banks, and so existing loans need to be replaced with new loans or just extended. This is also putting pressure on Chinese banks that were already struggling because of the real estate crash. If banks get too much bad debt on their balance sheet, people may start losing trust in the bank's ability to stay solvent, and that's a huge problem in itself. I'm sure most of you already know how the modern banking system works, but here's a quick overview for everyone else. Banks usually loan the money that depositors deposit and hope to earn interest on it to make a profit. Usually the reserve requirements is set by the central banks. So let's say it's 10%. This means that whenever the banks get $100 in deposits, they're required to only keep $10 in the vault, but they can loan out $90 and charge interest on it. This is just a simplified example, but these types of transactions happen millions of times over in an economy, and that's basically how the modern banking system works. For every $100 in deposits, banks are able to create $1,000 of money in circulation. Now, this system is actually pretty great. In the past century, a lot of economic growth is in part thanks to this fractional reserve banking. But the only way this works is if the depositors have trust in the bank's ability to keep their money safe. Now, if too many of these loans that banks are giving out become worthless, then that trust starts to fade. This is why the US enacted strict lending regulations after the 2008 crisis. So banks are careful with whom they lend to. Now, even with the CCP's new policy, banks are being careful as to which developers to extend the loans to, because they know that these are highly risky loans. This, in turn, is hurting the economy as paused projects means no more new real estate sales. This is where the big headaches lie for the CCP. The Chinese economy is heavily reliant on its financial sector and the real estate sector. Real estate represents around 30% of China's GDP, like I said, while 7 out of 10 of the top companies in China are financial institutions. The crash is spreading across the Chinese economy at a rate never seen before in the world. For comparison, when the US had its crash in 2008, real estate was only around 6% of the total GDP, and in the 90s in Japan, real estate was only around 9% of total GDP. So for China, any hit to real estate means a much bigger impact on the economy, even bigger than Japan's 1990s crash. Talking about Japan, when its real estate bubble popped, it led to a 20-year-long stagnation in the economy. Economists believe China can face a similar fate if things aren't handled carefully. Now, Japan's crisis was complex, and it deserves a video in itself, but here's a simplified overview so that we can talk about the similarities with China's current crisis. Much like China in the early 2000s, Japan's real estate market was booming before the 1990 crash. In fact, at one point, the land value of Tokyo was the same as the land value of the whole of the United States. There were multiple reasons behind why real estate prices soared so much, but the big one was the fact that their interest rates were near zero in the previous decade, which led to investors plowing money in real estate for higher returns. But when this bubble got too big, the central bank was forced to raise rates, which led to one of the most disastrous crashes in the Japanese economy. People were left paying mortgages on properties that were now worth less than the loan that they had, which led to belt tightening across the country and spending decline, just like it's happening in China. The downward spiral of deflation was so bad that it took Japan 2 decades to get things back to new highs in the stock market. GDP per capita is still around the same $40,000 that it was in the 1990s. To many, it seems like China may be heading in the same way. In fact, things may be worse for the CCP. Japan was less dependent on real estate than China is today. That means a crash in the Chinese market could have disastrous effects. But the CCP does have the benefit of knowing what happened to Japan in the 1990s, and hopefully lessons from the past can help the communist government manage this crisis. Because if the CCP fails, billions of people will suffer.
As Putin continues struggling in this war, he's running out of options. China, one of his only allies, is choosing to take full advantage of this desperation and get more out of him. Putin is now willing to give up Russian land to Xi Jinping just to have any hope of surviving this war. In return, it seems like China's helping Russia build more drones for the war through a secret drone project. In this video, we're going to talk about the prized piece of land that Russia's giving up to China, the assistance China's giving to Russia, and the future of China and Russia's allyship. Content like this is not always favored by the YouTube algorithm, but we're working hard to keep pushing out geopolitical videos. To help us reach our target audience, please like this video and share it with your friends and family. Now, let's get into the video. Before we go into what piece of Russian land Putin is parting with soon, let's talk about what he's getting in return from China. Drone warfare has become such an important part of the war for both sides, and Ukraine and Russia have been working to increase domestic drone production. In a meeting in St. Petersburg, Putin announced that the military was looking to increase the production of drones, emphasizing that whoever reacts faster to demands on the battlefield wins. As the war moves away from being focused on combat and airstrikes and attacks are taking over, reports show that Russia's been secretly building drones with the help of China. According to sources from a European intelligence agency, Russia established a weapons program in China to develop long-range attack drones for use in the war against Ukraine. The Russian company in charge of the program is IEMZ Kupol, which is a subsidiary of an arms company called Almaz Anti that is known for assisting the state. The drone model that Russia's looking to mass produce is called the Garpia 3, or G3, and it's been developed in China. This long-range drone travels 1,200 miles or 2,000 kilometers and can carry warheads of about 110 pounds. The G3 is an enhanced version of the Garpia A1, and Chinese experts have worked to redesign the G3 using the Garpia A1's blueprints. The Russian company Kupol was placed under sanctions in 2023, but China has still been assisting in developing drones for Russia using its own specialists. The drones are manufactured in China and then given to Kupol for testing. In an update to the government, Kupol told the Defense Ministry that they were mass-producing the G3 drones and other drones at a factory in China, and soon they would be able to deploy them for a special military operation in Ukraine. Some undated invoices that were discovered show that 7 war drones, including 2 G3s, were sent to Kupol this summer by a Russian company working as an intermediary for an unnamed supplier in China. Sources also show that another Russian defense company known as TSK Vector has been working as an intermediary between Kupol and a Chinese company named Redel plus TSK Vector Industrial to facilitate drone production. A separate document also shows that the 3 companies are working together to set up a project in China's Xinjiang province in an economic district known as Kashgar. Understanding the implications of this report, the Chinese Foreign Ministry immediately responded and said that it was unaware of any secret drone project and that it had close eyes on the exports of drones from its country. However, a lack of administration by the Foreign Ministry does not mean that it's not happening. It's no secret that civilian drones that have been manufactured by Chinese drone maker DJI are used by Russian forces, even though DJI has said that it actively denounces the use of its products in combat. This means that it's not enough for China to just condemn Russia's conduct without actively stopping it. Kopol and the Russian Defense Ministry are playing the silent game and did not respond to the allegations. Fabian Hinz, a research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, explained that if the reports were true, this would have significant consequences for China. Currently, China has only delivered dual-use goods that have been used for both general and military purposes. A secret drone system would be a very bold indication that it is for the war in Ukraine. In response to the report, the White House National Security Council stated that it's worried and interpreted China's actions as providing lethal assistance to a US-sanctioned Russian firm. Now we turn to Putin's trade for Russian land. Up until this point, China's been very strategic about how it helps Russia, attempting to be subtle and not come across as an aggressor. Throughout the war, China has not been a risk-taker, and when the US threatened sanctions if China kept assisting Russian businesses, Chinese banks were quick to cut transactions with Russia. Now, assisting in producing drones for the Ukrainian war is a sure way for China to be shunned by the international community and risk more sanctions. This means that whatever China is getting is definitely worth the trouble. This type of exchange is very unusual for Putin, whose entire reign has been built on amassing more territory for Russia. So we know that giving territory away is a sure sign of desperation. With most of the international community teaming up to ensure his downfall, Russia has very few options for survival. One of these options is China, which has been instrumental in keeping Moscow afloat in this time of sanctions. In the last quarter of 2023, China supplied 70% of Russia's imports of machine tools used for ballistic missile production. Throughout 2023, 90% of Russia's microelectronic imports also came from China. This equipment has been very important in Russia's war effort. In order to keep receiving assistance from China, Russia is going to give something up in return. The territory that China will potentially be receiving from this trade is the Tumen River. The river begins in Northeast Asia, between China and North Korea, and then goes into Russia. It's 324 miles long, and its basin size is 13,050 square miles. It starts at Mount Paektu, which is on the border between China and North Korea. The river then flows down through Russia until it reaches the Sea of Japan. About 30% of the river forms part of the North Korea-China border. 40% is the China-Russia border, and 30% forms part of the North Korea-Russia border. Although large parts of the river flow through all three countries, the distribution of access is not even. About 65% of the river flows through China, through the Jilin and Liaoning provinces. But China has the least amount of access. In the beginning, the river was Chinese territory during the Qing dynasty. Then came the Opium Wars between China and Western powers that ended very badly for the Qing Empire. Russia decided to take advantage of the weakening empire and signed the Treaty of Aigun with China, which saw Beijing losing a large number of territories. One of the terms was that the Qing Empire had to cede the Tumen River to the Russian Empire. Relations between the two nations were sour, but in 1991, Russia and China signed the Sino-Soviet Agreement that clarified the borders of the Tumen River. Article 9 of the agreement states, "The Soviet side and its related side agree that Chinese vessels carrying the Chinese flag can navigate back and forth along the Tumenjiang, or the Tumenaya River, which is described after the 33rd boundary point narrated in Article 2 of this agreement. This specific issue related to sailing shall be resolved by consultation from both parties." The agreement was welcomed by both nations, but China had some issues with it. One of the issues that China had was that the riverbed was shallow, so large ships couldn't really sail through. China's desire was that there would be some infrastructural development to help with its access issues. China wanted to step in and widen the river so it could get bigger vessels through. China's Coast Guard ships are really a sight to behold and are no match for the Tumen River in its current state. To give you a mental picture, China's CCG-5901 is the world's largest Coast Guard ship, and it's 8 times the size of an average US Coast Guard ship. The problem for China is that the agreement limited its involvement to just access. There was no incentive on either North Korea's or Russia's part to help China out. The current arrangement is also inconvenient for China because it has to sail all the way around the Korean peninsula to get to the Sea of Japan and its trading ports there. Now, it's very ironic to see that over 160 years later, China is using Russia's weakness to get the territory back. This incident proves that things are never ever forgiven and forgotten in politics, and most nations are just waiting for the opportunity to get their revenge. In the early parts of 2024, China was looking to negotiate with both North Korea and Russia for more access to the river. There had been a boost in China's commercial activity in the area, and China wanted to be able to use the river to link with the Sea of Japan. China would benefit because 3 of its eastern Chinese provinces would have a shorter route to Japan, North Korea's eastern ports, and the United States. This would reduce sailing time and cut costs significantly. Wang Wen, the executive dean for the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China, explained that allowing larger vessels to navigate through would facilitate the cheaper transporting of Chinese supplies, which would enhance its trade with countries like Japan and South Korea. In May 2024, Putin visited his friend Xi in China for a summit in Beijing, and talks about the river began. The meeting was in celebration of 75 years of diplomatic relations between the two, and they released a joint statement showing that the two of them spoke at length about long-term plans for cooperation between the two. In relation to the border discussion, the statement read, "The two sides will conduct constructive dialogue with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on the matter of Chinese vessels navigating to the sea via the lower reaches of the Tumen River." This statement shows that Russia's ready to bend to China's requests, but Putin just needs to get North Korea on board as well. Things have been looking up for China, because in June, both Russia and North Korea agreed to allow Chinese vessels to travel on the final 9.3 miles or 15-kilometer stretch of the river, which was currently blocked by a bridge and required permissions from Russia and North Korea. The only thing that's currently standing in China's way is North Korea. The truth is that North Korea doesn't really benefit from China being able to access the river. Because China wanted to be able to use the river, it had to develop the North Korean port of Rasin to be able to use it as an outlet to ship its trade out to the world. Kim Jong-un benefits from the current arrangement because all of China's goods have to pass through the port, and that's revenue for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In June 2024, Putin also paid a visit to North Korea for discussions, where the two leaders agreed to build another road bridge connecting Russia and North Korea over the Tumen River. There's already a bridge between the two named the Korea-Russia Friendship Bridge, but it seems like that wasn't enough. This special bridge was opened in 1959, and it's been a sign of the cooperation between North Korea and Russia since then. Through the bridge, trade between the two nations is facilitated, and it's also a symbol of the cultural ties between the two nations. While North Korea may be looking to drag its feet about the agreement, Putin doesn't really have much to lose. The area of Russian territory on the Tumen River is not utilized often, and all there is in the area is a rundown border post village. With the way things are looking for Putin, if he can't get North Korea on board, he may just have to cede his area to China alone. Under this transaction, both nations will benefit in the end. It might be difficult to understand why Russia's so dependent on China's drones if you don't know what Russia's arsenal's currently looking like. Recently, we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a channel on YouTube. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes these take up too much time or they ask the same question we've answered before. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So if you're someone who's interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get your email bootcamp by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Now, back to the video. As the battle's gone on and Ukraine has succeeded in its attacks on Russian artillery, the Kremlin's resorted to relying on outdated equipment and bringing some pieces from the archives. One of the outdated machines that's made a reappearance on the battlefield is the T-55 tank. Satellite images that circulated on social media show that Russia's taken out a dozen of these tanks from a base in Arsenyev. These specific tanks were first commissioned in 1948 by the Soviet Union's Red Army. According to John Delaney, a senior curator at the Imperial War Museum, they've been sitting there for a decade or more. They'll need a considerable amount of work to get them back into good running order. We need to also understand that even if Russia wanted to produce weaponry that could rival those made by its competitors, the brain drain affecting the country wouldn't allow it. When the war started out in 2022, many people began to flee. According to estimates, up to 1 million out of some 144 million Russians left the country in 2022 and 2023, in what's been the largest brain drain since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This number includes young and able-bodied individuals who would have been integral to the design and manufacturing of military equipment for the Russian army. Because of this, Russia has had to turn to China to fill the gaping void. Now we turn to discuss how bad things have gotten for Putin. His desperation is worrying, and we need to get to the bottom of how dire things are for the Kremlin to understand this trade of land. It's well known that Putin entered the war with Ukraine cockily, with the expectation that it would be over in 3 weeks. 2.5 years later, Putin is still fighting a war and stretching his resources thin on all ends. The surprise invasion of Kursk in August by Ukraine was a significant turning point in the war. From then on, Russia has been experiencing attack after attack. Let's first talk about Ukraine's recent successes in the war. The recent drone attacks in Ukraine have been bringing the war into Russian territories, and Putin doesn't know what to do about it. Yuri Ihnat, a spokesman for Ukraine's Air Force, commented on the latest drone attacks, saying, "There's always something flying in Russia, as well as in Moscow. Now the war's affecting those who weren't concerned. No matter how the Russian authorities would like to turn a blind eye on this by saying that they've intercepted everything, something does hit." In early September, 140 Ukrainian drones were launched for a targeted attack that hit multiple Russian regions overnight. In the town of Ramenskoye, which is not far from Moscow, 1 woman died and 8 people were reportedly injured. The drone attack started explosive fires that took out 2 multi-story residential buildings in the Moscow region. After the first couple of hits, about 5 residential buildings had to be evacuated. For the first time, Russian authorities were forced into action, and Vnukovo, Domodedovo, and Zhukovsky airports were shut down for fear that the drones might target the biggest airports in Russia. This attack really embarrassed Putin, who'd been trying very hard to pretend that everything's under control. On September 1st, Ukraine launched another drone attack, which hit a refinery and power station inside Russia. The drones also targeted some oil reservoirs in the Rostov region, causing extensive damage. Throughout September, Ukraine has been launching attack after attack without giving Russia a moment to breathe. Another fatal drone attack hit a Russian missile facility using large Ukrainian drones. The attack took out a large portion of Russia's arsenal as the facility was being used to store missiles and other explosives. In response to these attacks, Ukraine has said that it has wiped off the face of the earth a large warehouse of the main missile and artillery department. Ukraine has been very strategic in its drone attacks and has stuck to attacking important infrastructure like airfields, military bases, and oil refineries. Last week, a Ukrainian missile strike targeted a headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. The footage shows smoke over the building in Sevastopol. This is not the first time that Ukraine's attacked Crimea, and many of its drone attacks are known to take out Russian vessels that are docked at the port in Sevastopol. In another attack, Ukrainian forces struck 15 air defense systems in Crimea, taking out several S-300, S-350, and S-400 air defense systems. Ukraine also hit 15 radar stations and over 10 control centers stationed in the Russian-occupied peninsula using the Ukrainian kamikaze drones. In places like Belgorod, Voronezh, and Lipetsk, Ukraine has purposefully hit military bases and other sites as well. The reason why Ukraine intentionally hits these locations is because they're responsible for fueling Russia's war machine. Ukraine understands that it needs to stretch its limited resources far, and it's a strategy like this that it's kept it ahead of Russia. Putin has been left reeling by such attacks as the cost of replenishing his stock is high and the nation's coffers are empty. Putin is desperate for China's help because he can't afford to carry on fighting the war. He hopes that with the new drone supply, he can land more definitive blows that will end the war in his favor. He can no longer justify the rising death toll, which, according to Business Insider, is 1,000 soldiers a day. On September 17, 2024, the UK Ministry of Defence and Defence Intelligence estimated that Russia had suffered over 610,000 casualties. Putin is in a sticky situation because he's gone too far in the war, and now he's trying to cut his losses. An extensive report by the General Staff listed all of Russia's losses since 2022. So far, Russia has lost 554,510 troops, 8,180 tanks, 15,715 armored fighting vehicles, 20,269 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,051 artillery systems, 1,115 multiple launch rocket systems, 883 air defense systems, 361 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 11,973 drones, 28 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. At the rate that Russia's losing artillery, it needs China's help to continue to resupply its army. One of the many things that Russia's also underestimated was the support that Ukraine was going to get from its allies. This has also led Putin to this point of desperation. Every week, there are announcements about a new world power pouring money into Ukraine's military fund. Recently, Sweden donated its 16th military aid package valued at around $2.14 billion. This donation included F-16 fighter jets and an airborne surveillance and control aircraft, or ASC-890, to help Ukraine fight against Russia's monopoly in the sky. Then, again this month, an Australian company called Electro-Optic Systems transferred 160 Slinger anti-drone systems to assist the Ukrainian military. In August, Downing Street gave Ukraine the go-ahead to use British weapons for operations on Russian territory, and reports have shown that it uses British Challenger 2 tanks inside Russia. Against all of this support, the odds aren't looking good for Putin. This has forced him to rely on China's assistance, and this help has come at the price of some land. While external pressures can be taxing, we can't underestimate the power of domestic disapproval. If Putin doesn't secure a win soon, he's going to be leaving the Kremlin. The disapproval of Putin is so wide-reaching, and for once, despite class and differences, the majority of Russia can agree that a losing war is being fought. The first group that's pushing Putin to the point of desperation is the army. This is not good, because these are the people on the ground fighting the war effort. Soldiers are turning against Putin, and most of them have complained about lacking motivation to fight. Unfortunately, Putin's choice of military leadership has placed him in an awkward position. The top brass has mismanaged military funds, and this has led to shortages in equipment and resources. Many of the soldiers have told horrifying stories of being forced to the front line without having helmets or flak jackets. The number of desertions has also risen over the past couple of months. In June 2024, Mediazona reported that more than 10,000 Russian fighters have been accused of refusing to serve in the war since its start in 2022. Of these 10,000, 339 have been accused of desertion. According to Ukraine's GUR military agency, more than 18,000 Russian soldiers had deserted, and almost 12,000 of these fighters were part of the army that was fighting extensively in eastern Ukraine. Losing the support of his military at such a crucial time has pushed Putin into looking for alternative forms of warfare, and the special drone project is his last hope of survival. Another group of people who aren't happy with Putin are his powerful allies and friends. His ascension into power was backed by many powerful businessmen and militia leaders who believed that they could benefit from his reign. However, as they watch Russia struggling in the war against Ukraine, they've changed their minds. In 2023, there was Prigozhin's revolt against Putin, but this year, another brave militia leader stood up against Putin. George Zakrevsky, the leader of the Paladin Military Union, has asked Russian soldiers to come together to overthrow the government and condemn Putin's leadership. In a message to Telegram, Zakrevsky called on the Russian soldiers to join his noble movement and union and ditch Putin, declaring, "Our country's already in deep trouble. Drones fly over central Russia, even reaching Moscow and St. Petersburg. Our Black Sea Fleet is being decimated as if we were a third-rate nation. This so-called president, the Great Putin, has led us into this disaster." Another important group of people who are no longer behind Russia are the oligarchs. In the beginning, they used their money and their influence to fund Putin's endeavors. But as Russia continues to be bled dry, they can't stand by him any longer. Billionaire Oleg Tinkov, who founded Russia's Tinkoff Bank in 2006, is one of the Russian oligarchs who have completely bashed the war. Like most wealthy people in Russia, he's been subject to sanctions, and so the war doesn't have his support. In a post to Instagram, he wrote, "I don't see a single beneficiary of this insane war. Innocent people and soldiers are dying. In turning to China for help, Russia's trying to save what's left of the war effort. The only way that he'll be able to get everything back on track is if he can somehow secure some wins in the war again. Some advances in the war will win him back the support of his allies and the Russian people, too. The state of the Russian economy currently has left Putin scrambling for solutions, even from unlikely places. According to the US Treasury, the war and the accompanying sanctions have cut 5% of Russia's economic growth. Russia's GDP has also dropped by 2.1%, with the government's revenue plunging by 35%. And at the end of 2023, there was a budget deficit of about $23.3 billion. The cost of basic goods in the country has risen by 25%, and banks are failing to maintain interest rates. To make matters worse, Russia can no longer rely on China for foreign currency after the US threatened to place secondary sanctions on China for assisting Russia. The downward spiral of the economy and the accumulative effect of the sanctions have left Putin in a tight spot as he continues to pursue his war effort. The problem is that Putin is not one to give up, so the secret drone project is his solution to the problem. If he can't get his army and allies to stand behind him, he's turning to the next best thing. Putin has very few options left, and China is currently his saving grace. The trade is also not as difficult for him because he has no territorial ambitions around the Tumen River. With this secret drone project, Russia hopes to be able to launch more offensives in Ukraine and take back the control it had in the beginning. China is very opportunistic too, and sees Russia's desperation as an opportunity to rewrite some wrongs. Unfortunately for Putin, he's out of options, so he'll have to trade land with China to gain land from Ukraine. President Xi of China has sent a strict warning to Putin, and disobeying it may have disastrous results. Xi has told Putin that in no case is Russia allowed to use nuclear weapons. China has the unfortunate job of trying to deter Putin, and it looks like this babysitting has reached its peak. With the war intensifying and Russia scrambling to get some sort of victory on the front lines, Beijing's afraid that Moscow will turn the war nuclear. In this video, we're going to look at why China's telling Russia to back off, the current status of their friendship, and the potential for a massive nuclear war should these warnings fail. We're working overtime to keep you guys posted, but sometimes it's hard to do that with all the CCP and Putin bots downvoting our YouTube content. If you're enjoying our videos, please give this one a like and share it with all your friends and family too. Right, now let's get straight into the video. First, let's go into why China's warning Russia again now. Ukraine's successful invasion of Kursk has left Russia stunned, and as the West is getting closer to granting permission to use its weapons inside Russian territory, Putin feels that he needs to remind them what he's capable of. As the discussions between the UK, the US, and Ukraine have intensified, Putin has publicly come out in numerous interviews and said that he's not afraid to use nukes. However, China's position on nuclear warfare has been very clear from day one. It's not in the best interest of its country to have itself or 3/4 of the world completely vaporized. The spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Mao Ning, confirmed the position at a press conference in Beijing, saying, "China has repeatedly reiterated that nuclear weapons cannot be used, or that a nuclear war cannot be fought. The reason that this conversation's back in rotation is because of the comments made by the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov in early September. He expressed that there were talks about changing the nuclear doctrine due to the Western adversaries' escalation of things. In his comments, he explained that the policy was in its advanced stages of completion, and the clear intent was to correct some parts of the doctrine based on an examination of recent developments in the conflict. These developments include how the West has escalated the issue by providing military aid to Ukraine. What was even more frightening for China was that a commercial satellite firm called Planet Labs had 2 American scientists report that they discovered construction happening around a nuclear warhead storage facility, known as Voldaga 20 in Chebsara, about 300 miles north of Moscow. The satellite imagery also showed the possible launch site for a nuclear missile. Pavel Podvig also commented on these developments, telling Newsweek that they showed that the system was getting closer to operational deployment as Russia was building an operational site. Although it's too early to say, that is definitely the direction it's going. What confirms this story more are pictures posted by Radio Free Europe journalist Mark Krutov on X, showing the changes in the construction site from 2022 to 2023. China then came out again and made it clear that it does not want its ally Russia to escalate the war into a nuclear one, because of what it fears will happen if things get worse. Pavel Podvig also said that all parties in the situation need to remain calm and work together to try and move towards de-escalation and work towards dialogue. In late 2022, during a visit by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Chinese President Xi warned Putin not to use nuclear weapons. During the meeting, he asked Scholz to lead the peace talks between the two nations. In a statement carried by China's state news agency Xinhua, Xi said that the world should advocate for nuclear weapons not to be used, and stated that nuclear weapons should not be deployed in order to prevent a nuclear crisis in Europe and Asia. In 2022, when Xi and Biden met during the G20 summit, he used the opportunity to let the White House know exactly where he stood on the matter. This was the first time that Xi had expressed any criticism of Putin, and this subtle discussion revealed a lot. The fact that Xi was willing to talk about the situation with a sworn enemy shows how important it is to him that peace is maintained. After the summit, the American president confirmed Xi's stance, stating that they had a shared belief that the threat of nukes was unacceptable. The White House also released a statement explaining that the two presidents emphasized their agreement that nuclear war could not happen, and that such a war could never be won. In 2023, Xi Jinping took the message straight from the White House to the Kremlin. He warned Vladimir Putin against using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, clearly showing that Beijing has concerns about Russia's war effort in Ukraine. This happened at a face-to-face meeting during Xi's state visit to Moscow. It's clear that after the talks, Xi felt very strongly that he was behind Putin's current backing down, and Chinese officials have privately taken credit for deterring the Russian president. In 2024, when Xi and Putin met again, Xi made sure to get a joint statement between the two parties saying that they would not choose nuclear war. This joint statement stated that there can be no winners in a nuclear war, and it should never be fought. What's even more frustrating is that Russia's change in policy goes against the stance it took in 2022. In January of 2022, 5 nuclear weapon states, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, issued a joint statement agreeing to the prevention of nuclear war. The statement reads, "We affirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. As nuclear use would have far-reaching consequences, we affirm that nuclear weapons, for as long as they continue to exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war. We strongly believe that the further spread of such weapons must be prevented." The last words of the statement read, "We are resolved to pursue constructive dialogue with mutual respect and acknowledgement of each other's security interests and concerns." Russia's personal stance has always been that it may employ its nuclear arsenal in the event of a nuclear attack by an enemy or an attack that threatens the existence of the state. Now, with Ukraine ramping up its war efforts, Putin has the justification he needs to pull the trigger. The policy is to deploy nuclear weapons in the event that the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. This means that any act of aggression by Ukraine is enough for Russia to strike. Putin was very strategic in declaring Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Russian territories, because he planned to take Ukraine's fight for the territories as a threat to Russia's territorial integrity. Now, with Ukraine conducting drone attacks in Crimea and the Black Sea, Russia has the reason it's been waiting for. Putin's been threatening to use nuclear force for most of 2024, and now those threats may be actualized. For the longest time, the global question has been whether or not he's been bluffing, but there have been too many hints that he may not be. During his annual State of the Nation address, Putin warned Western countries that if they sent their troops into Ukraine, he would not hesitate to use his nuclear weapons. The escalation in threats came after the infamous comments made by French President Emmanuel Macron, suggesting that NATO allies could send troops to Ukraine in the future. In March, during an interview, Putin went on to speak about how his country was ready from a military point of view to get into the action. He also boasted that Russia's nukes were more modern than even the West's. Recently in September, coincidentally before British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was set to meet President Biden to discuss the lifting of restrictions in Kiev, Putin sat down to do a state television interview. When asked about what the effect of West and NATO involvement would be, this is what Putin had to say. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean their direct involvement in the conflict, and it will clearly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict dramatically. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States, and European countries are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us. These appropriate decisions are most likely the nuclear attacks that he's been threatening to use all year long. Knowing the type of man Putin is, the intensity of China's warning is adequate.
Мы здесь продвинулись гораздо больше. У нас она более современная. И вся ядерная составляющая. В целом по носителям и по зарядам у нас примерный паритет, но у нас более современная. Но это знают все, специалисты все знают. Но это не значит, что мы должны мериться.
Despite what the rumors may be, it looks like China may not be 100% behind Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Let's address something that's been on my mind before we move forward. After watching my videos or other YouTubers' videos, I'm sure some of you guys have thought about starting your own channel. One of the biggest hurdles people face when starting a YouTube channel is they're not comfortable showing their face on videos. Not everyone wants to give up their privacy and be in the public eye all the time. That's one of the big reasons why our videos are made in documentary style. Craziest part is, people still love the videos, as you can clearly see from the fact that we recently crossed 1 million subscribers. In fact, there are millions of faceless YouTube channels making content and earning that ad revenue. In just the last 3 years, YouTube's paid out $70 billion to creators. That's around $60 million every single day. So if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, right now's the perfect time. That's why we launched a completely free 7-day email crash course on how to start and grow a faceless YouTube channel. If that's something you're interested in, you can sign up now for free by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. Now, let's get back to the topic at hand. Despite what the rumors may be, it looks like China may not be 100% behind Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This has placed Moscow and Beijing at odds for the first time, and it'll be interesting to see if their relationship survives this. It seems that there are limitations to the relationship that Xi declared had no limits after all. Shi Yanhong, a professor of international relations at Renmin University in Beijing, said that Russia has never and will never have China's approval for using nuclear weapons. If Russia used nuclear weapons against Ukraine, China will further distance itself from Russia. The wars place China in a complex situation because it needs to worry about the perception of its support of Russia in the war. So far, China has not endorsed or condemned Putin's actions directly. To try and balance all parties, China's tried to deflect the situation and claim that NATO's expansion into the region is what led to Russia retaliating. It's clear that China values its friendship with Russia, but it also wants to position itself as a neutral party that advocates for peacemaking. This dilemma could cause the relationship between them to wane, as China continues to get in trouble on Russia's behalf. China also has relationships with the US, Japan, and some European Union countries, but it already looks bad currently because it's on the same side as a dictator. If the war escalates to a nuclear one, China can kiss those relationships goodbye. Already, NATO countries believe that China's an enabler because of its no-limits partnership with Russia. In the past months, the US and European leaders have accused China of helping Russia in its defense sector by supplying it with dual-use goods. Beijing has denied these claims and stated that it only supplied regular goods to Russia. China responded to the European Union's accusations with a statement stating that China is not the creator of the Ukraine crisis. China's position on Ukraine is open and above board. We aim to promote peace talks and seek political settlement. These accusations, with the added threat of secondary sanctions from the US if they keep working with Russian companies, will only drive the wedge further. Xi realizes how bad things will get if he does not try to stop Putin from starting a nuclear war, so he's warning him to leave the nukes out of it. Now, some of you may be curious to know what nuclear power Russia has, so we're going to discuss what's in their artillery. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated that as of January this year, Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. Russia currently has 4,380 deployed or stored warheads, while the US, China, France, and the UK have 3,708, 500, 290, and 225 nukes respectively. So, Russia has two types of nuclear weapons, tactical and strategic. The tactical ones are the small nuclear warheads and delivery systems that are meant to be used on the battlefield for a limited strike. These ones are handy because they're made to destroy enemy targets in a specific area without causing widespread radioactive fallout. These weapons can be between 1 kiloton to 100 kilotons depending on the type. The more deadly ones, and the ones that everyone's afraid of, are the strategic nuclear weapons, which can go up to 1,000 kilotons. Although the strategic ones are deadly, Russia has about 2,000 tactical weapons according to US intelligence. This type of nuclear head can be dropped from an aircraft and fired from ships, and it has the capacity to fit on many types of missiles. On top of these warheads, Russia has two systems that would be able to carry short-range missile attacks. The Caliber missile is a land attack cruise missile that has an estimated range of 1,553 miles. Sources from US naval intelligence said that a Russian official revealed that Russia plans to deploy Caliber capability on all new design, construction, nuclear and non-nuclear submarines, corvettes, frigates, and larger surface ships. Caliber provides even modest platforms such as corvettes with significant offensive capability. And with the use of the land attack missile, all platforms have a significant ability to hold distant fixed ground targets at risk using conventional warheads. The proliferation of this capability within the new Russian Navy is profoundly changing its ability to deter, threaten, or destroy adversary targets. It can be logically assumed that Caliber capability will be retrofitted on those larger Soviet legacy ships and submarines that undergo major overhauls and/or modernization. The second system is a mobile land missile system known as Iskander-M missile launcher SS-26 Stone. This is the Russian mobile short-range hypersonic ballistic missile system that has been used in many combat situations, including the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Now, there's one nuclear weapon called the Burevestnik that is so lethal that NATO nicknamed it the SSC-X9 Skyfall. This is a global nuclear-powered cruise missile, and in 2023, Putin announced that they'd tested it out, stating, "We now have virtually finished work on modern types of strategic weaponry about which I have spoken, and which I announced a few years ago." A final successful test has been held of Burevestnik, a global-range nuclear-powered cruise missile. Putin has boasted of its almost unlimited range, and sources report that it has the ability to go as far as the US. Its range is about 15,000 miles, and it also has the ability to evade US missile defenses. With an arsenal fully loaded and that impressive, it's no surprise that China's working overtime to stop Russia from pulling the nuclear trigger. While he may still be too afraid to launch the longer-range ones, Russia would most probably be okay with using the smaller tactical heads to hit specific locations. According to Patricia Lewis, head of the International Security Program at the Chatham House think tank, they might not see it as crossing this big nuclear threshold. Another possibility is that Russia could be gearing up for war as payback for something that happened in May 2023. One random night in May, a drone flew over the Kremlin before being shot down in a fiery explosion. In the beginning, nobody really knew where the attacks were coming from. Both Ukraine and the US denied that the drones had come from Ukraine, and Ukraine reiterated that it had not been given access to use long-range drones. Throughout the weeks, the drones kept coming, and Putin began to be embarrassed by the continuous attacks. After investigation, it became clear that the drones were actually Ukrainian-made. Based on flight footage of the drones, Moscow found out that Ukraine was scaling up its homegrown drone fleet to attack more frequently in Russia. What's cool about this story is that the funding for making these Ukrainian drones was led by a 23-year-old influencer called Ihor Lechenkov. He claims that Ukrainian military services asked him to fundraise the project. Using his million followers from Telegram, he was able to raise about $500,000 to build a fleet he called the kamikaze drones. 3 drones that have been identified by the Times are the Bober, the UJ-22, and an unnamed model. These have all been used to target Moscow, and the attacks increased between May and July of 2023. These drones can carry 3 kilograms of explosives up to 621 miles. Putin didn't react at the time of these attacks, and Ukraine may have thought they managed to get away with it. The truth is that Putin's been keeping a tally, and now as Ukraine increases its offensive, Putin's ready to show the world that he was not bluffing. China understands that a nuclear war could lead to a global catastrophe of unprecedented levels. Let's try to simulate what will happen if war breaks out. As soon as one side launches a missile, the other side has systems that will detect it and fire back before impact. These attacks take a few minutes, and a missile from America could hit Russia in 10 minutes, while a land-based intercontinental missile will take about 30 minutes to hit. The first strikes will take out electronics, while the next will target command and control centers and nuclear launch facilities. After taking out nuclear launch facilities, the next missiles will be headed for major cities that contain military facilities. Russia would probably hit Ukraine first, but NATO allies like France and the US that have nuclear abilities will also be targets. These explosions will literally vaporize people nearby and cause blindness to those who are further away. The damage to infrastructure will be horrific, with firestorms engulfing many cities and taking out anything that's in their way. After the heat from the firestorm, the next disaster will be a nuclear winter caused by black carbon smoke from the nuclear firestorms. A large city like Moscow will create a lot of smoke, and the firestorm from that will send black smoke up into the stratosphere. This black smoke will get heated by sunlight and create a type of hot air balloon for up to a decade. This would make the Earth freezing cold, even during the summer, as if we don't have enough issues with global warming already. A scientific study shows that over 5 billion people could starve to death, and most of these people will be from the US, Europe, Russia, and China, because most black carbon smoke stays up in the northern hemisphere where it's produced. The radioactive fallout that comes with such explosions is detrimental, and even worse than what we saw happen in Hiroshima. This contamination will linger for years or even decades, and survivors will have to stay inside for more than 48 hours before it's even close to safe to go outside. The types of bombs being made today have the capacity to create a global fallout. The effect can be felt globally because the radioactive material rises into the stratosphere and can spread out from there. What's so scary about a nuclear war is that it can happen so quickly but have lifelong effects. BBC News put it perfectly by saying, "Mass destruction has long been possible, but it's never been so easy." She understands this and knows that out of all the world leaders, he may be the only one who could be able to get through to Putin. The two leaders have mutual respect for each other, and she could use this to continue to push that the war does not turn nuclear. Unfortunately for she and the rest of the world, dealing with a leader like Putin means hoping that he doesn't do anything crazy when you least expect it.
In what will be the biggest battle of the seas, the US Navy is making plans to go to war with the People's Liberation Army in 2027. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, has issued new guidance to help prepare the US Navy for an unavoidable conflict with China. The plan is known as Project 33, and it aims to enhance naval readiness and strengthen the US Navy's role in the broader US joint warfighting ecosystem. The US Navy has been lying derelict for the past couple of years, but a new threat on the horizon has pushed the gears into motion. 2027 is about to be either the year that a major battle is deterred, or the year that the tensions in the South China Sea reach a breaking point. But first, we need to talk about something that's been affecting our videos lately. CCP bots are constantly in our comments trying to downvote our videos. So to help us out, please give this video a like and share it with your friends and your family. We truly appreciate it. The year 2027 has been set as D-Day because of very important information acquired by US intelligence. According to the Pentagon, there is proof that Xi is planning an invasion of Taiwan that year. In 2021, during a speech to the People's Liberation Army, President Xi challenged them to accelerate their modernization programs to develop capabilities to seize Taiwan. During this talk, Xi urged the PLA to move the year of invasion from 2035 to 2027. This launch day, which has been discussed in Congress, has been nicknamed the Davidson window after Admiral Phil Davidson, the retiring head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. According to the Admiral, the threat of the Chinese invasion of Taiwan will inevitably manifest itself in this decade, and what has further accelerated the U.S.'s drive to repair its Navy fleet is China's suspicious activity in the Taiwan Strait.
Once again, tension is high in the Taiwan Strait. China launching massive military exercises, its army, navy and rocket forces encircling the self-governed island, simulating a blockade and drilling down on Taiwan's ports, and releasing this video.
Taiwan has been on high alert for the past couple of months after China declared a snap joint military exercise and ordered an aircraft carrier battle group to circle the nation. Along with the announcement about beginning its exercises, it released a map showing the areas it will be surrounding, which is pretty much a blockade around Taiwan. It seems that China's aggression is in immediate response to a speech by the Taiwanese president during a National Day speech. In the speech, President Lai Ching-te vowed to resist annexation and denounce the CCP's hold on any form of sovereignty over his democratic state. Beijing was not very happy about this, and the PLA responded by releasing a combat training video that showed its readiness to enter into war. Taiwan was expecting this type of retaliation, especially since the military drills also began hours after Taipei detected a Chinese aircraft on its southeastern coast. The PLA's military video was titled Xin Ge Dai Dan, which means resting on a dagger axe and waiting for the dawn. According to CCP military commentator Zhang Junxi, the video serves as a warning to Taiwan independence forces and the external forces seeking to interfere in China's domestic affairs. Every time Taiwan or any other nation threatens China's claim on Taiwan, it responds in this way to show off its strength. The US does not want to be found unprepared when China eventually makes a move, and that's why its preparations have been accelerated for 2027. The new plan by Admiral Lisa Franchetti identifies 7 critical areas that the US Navy is going to be focused on. We're going to go through them together to see how serious the US is about preparing for this war. The first area that the Navy wants to tackle is maintenance delays. The procrastination around getting ships, submarines, and aircraft into tip-top order needs to change. Under the new plan, things will be divided in this efficient way. At any given time, 1/3 of the ships and attack submarines should be in maintenance, 1/3 in training, and 1/3 on or ready for deployment. If the equipment spends too much time in maintenance, it affects precision and slows down the response time during an active fight. These details might not seem to matter right now, but during combat, these things will be what separates the winners from the losers. Combat surge can be increased by fixing the maintenance problem, and Project 33 is aiming for an 80% readiness posture for ships, submarines, and aircraft. The second part of the plan is to work on increasing robotic and autonomous systems. Through the Russian-Ukrainian war, we have witnessed how frail human life is. As the number of casualties has soared, countries are realizing that they may need to start thinking about ways to fight the war without people. The US Navy's mission is to create a hybrid fleet that has manned ships and those that can work remotely. By 2027, the Navy will have commanders controlling robotic and autonomous systems that will allow them to reduce the number of personnel in an actual war. Perhaps one of the most important areas for Project 33 is the creation of a state-of-the-art command center that will tie everything together in a distributed battlefield. Fighting a distributed fight is very complex, but there needs to be a way for all commands and steps to be given from a centralized point. Admiral Franchetti is looking to set up maritime operations centers that will allow fleet-level warfare to be executed from the top all the way to the bottom. Having a centralized system means information is passed on faster, and decision-making becomes easier during a crisis. In time for war in 2027, all fleet headquarters, starting at the Pacific Fleet, We'll have ready maritime operation centers that are effective and work quickly to respond to changes in strategy and plans. Next, in order to win the game, you need to have the winning team. The US Navy is looking to recruit and train the best players in the field to be able to respond well to the threat. The force is looking to get the best of both sailors and civilians to fill in places on ships, command centers, submarines, clinics, and boot camps. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the year, the Navy started off with a shortfall of 22,000 sailors. To deal with this failure, the Navy is trying to get to a point where the swap between active and reserve sailors is seamless. By 2027, the plan is aiming for a 100% filling rate for the Navy's active and reserve people, 95% filling of military positions, and a 100% recruiting shipping fill. With these types of numbers, the Navy will be able to keep its personnel stocked during an active conflict. The fifth critical area that the Navy wants to work on, which is linked to why it is having a personnel crisis, is sailor satisfaction. Project 33 wants to provide a quality of life for its sailors that is proportional to their commitment to the force. The focus of the plan is going to be junior enlisted sailors as the Navy tries to push its resignation rates down to 0. To do this, the Navy will eliminate waitlists, provide quality unaccompanied housing, and eliminate involuntary living aboard ships in the home port. The next important critical area is the training of the warfighter. In order to prepare for war, training needs to simulate the war environment. To prepare for battle with China, training will be with live forces, virtual environments, and constructive scenarios as well. Project 33 plans to update its live, virtual, and constructive architecture so that it is reliable and realistic enough. By the time war comes around, LVC must be available everywhere and accessible to all troops so that they can be prepared for everything. The final step in the plan has to do with shore readiness. This is all about the overall preparedness of Navy vessels, sailors, ports, and docks for war. Making sure that all cylinders are firing at full capacity is very important for the fight. This means making use of dry docks that are part of the maintenance and refurbishment of ships. The Navy will support Navy task-critical assets in repairing infrastructure, including piers and runways, that are in poor condition. In all its planning, the US Navy has one North Star. By 2027, the Navy will be more ready for sustained combat as part of a joint and combined force, prioritizing the People's Republic of China as the pacing challenge and focusing on enabling the joint warfighting ecosystem. Commenting on this elaborate plan, the Admiral stated, "These are areas that I can put my thumb on a scale. We can make a difference in those areas, and we will make meaningful contributions to our ability to be more ready by 2027. Now, a 7-step plan may seem like a lot, but it's a necessary response to the threat at hand. Joshua Tallis, a senior research scientist at the Center for Naval Analysis, explained that when it comes to winning a war on the water, it's not just down to ship count. So even if the US had more warships than China, the question is, how good is its warfighting ecosystem? Currently, it's not very good, and that's why the plan is important. Franchetti's plan also has the backing of politicians in the US who have been afraid of the US falling behind. Representative Joe Courtney, a Democrat from Connecticut, and a ranking member of the Sea Power Subcommittee under the House Armed Services Committee, believes that the plan is right on target and emphasizes the need to focus on U.S. shipyards.
From 2015 to 2019, 38 of 51 maintenance periods for aircraft carriers and submarines at the nation's 4 publicly owned naval shipyards were completed late. It adds up to a combined total of more than 7,400 days of maintenance delay. For aircraft carriers, 8 of 18 repair jobs were finished on time. For submarines, only 5 of 33 jobs were completed on schedule.
Indeed, since 2012, 2/3 of the Navy ships and submarine maintenance availabilities have been completed late, leading to tens of thousands of lost operational and training days.
Our 4 public shipyards have too few functional dry docks and are equipped with capital equipment well beyond a service life that was originally manufactured by companies that no longer exist.
The Navy says it aims to do better.
And we look forward to the opportunities to improve across the enterprise and execute NAVSEA's #1 priority of delivering combat power on time.
These are the reasons why it's becoming extremely important for America to deal with the state of its shipyards. Reports show that in the 1980s, the US had about 300 shipyards, and today it only has around 20. This has completely reduced its ability to maintain its equipment, adding to the issue of fewer floating docks for destroyer ships and submarines. Although the nature of war has drastically changed, there is still the need for a fighting nation to have a first-class fleet. The problem is that the US is shrinking the size of its fleet drastically while slowing down how fast it builds replacement warships. It also does not help that US shipyards are facing skilled labor shortages because of past budget cuts and layoffs that have cut down on the specialized workforce. The American system needs to phase out its high-cost legacy warships and destroyers and focus on putting together a fleet that can be built rapidly. A page can be taken from China's strategy, which allows it to build both military and civilian vessels in the same shipyard, boosting its shipmaking capacity. To respond to the dire need for shipbuilding, one of the options on the table was outsourcing the task to either Japan or South Korea. Unfortunately, that plan was shut down, as the US felt like it would be surrendering its capabilities to a third party. Another important part of the Navy's plan is the shipbuilding aspect, which would increase the fleet to a healthy number of 381 total ships over 35 years. There is still a lot of work to be done in that aspect, considering the fact that the US is still taking forever to build ships and using outdated systems. So on top of making sure that the shipyards are maintained, the Navy will also be working to ensure that shipyards are modernized and more investment is pushed into submarine creation. And like the rest of us, the US Navy has also been watching the war in Ukraine, and it has been learning a few things. Now, recently we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a channel on YouTube. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes this can take up too much time, or people ask the same questions that we've answered before. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting up your own YouTube channel, you can get our email bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Okay, let's get back to the video. In her strategy, Franchetti spoke about how incorporating drones into the battle would be a good part of the fight. The Pentagon has been working hard at developing artificial intelligence drones, and they could be a big part of fighting against China in the South China Sea. Using drones would be good for implementing sea denial. This is basically when you prevent your enemy from even using the sea for military or economic purposes. Mine warfare, anti-ship missiles, and drones can be used to achieve this. If the US could implement these into its strategy, it would be able to reduce China's dominance in the sea. Stephen Wills from the Center for Maritime Strategy explained the strategy by stating that if the Navy gives each ship its own flotilla of uncrewed ships with missiles, some self-defense weapons, and a couple of drones, the fleets would be unstoppable. In February of 2024, reports by the Asian Times stated that the US Department of Defense was taking design proposals for low-cost autonomous drone boats under the production-ready, inexpensive Maritime Expeditionary, PRIME, Small Unmanned Surface Vehicle, SUSV, project. The project was looking for designs that could travel 500 to 1,000 nautical miles while carrying a 1,000-pound payload and achieving at least 35 knot speed. If the US manages to secure these designs and develop this style of drone, it will improve its control of the sea. This plan is very audacious. In 2027, it's not really as far away from today as you might think. Stephen Wills has also been a critic of the plan, questioning if the surging of ships was feasible. In his critique, he has stated, "That's a big lift. I'm not sure how we get there, considering we have less than 300 ships, and we keep 1/3 of them always deployed, so that's going to be a challenge. I'm not sure how the Navy fully overcomes that." Another reason behind the skepticism is the comparison to the state of China's Navy. According to the Pentagon, China has the largest navy in the world, with an overall battle force of approximately 350 ships and submarines, including over 130 major surface combatants. China is also the top ship-producing nation in the world in terms of tonnage. Right now, China's 13 naval shipyards have more capacity than all 7 naval US shipyards combined. This is alarming, right? The Chinese Navy is growing rapidly, and its control of the South China Sea is increasing day by day. Estimates by the Congressional Research Service report that China is expected to have 395 ships by 2025 and 435 ships by 2030, while the US Navy operates 296 ships and will likely have 294 by the end of fiscal 2030. Both navies have a very diverse range of ships, including large aircraft carriers, submarines, combat-built destroyer ships, and agile amphibious assault ships. However, China's military shipbuilding is outpacing the US. According to Admiral Samuel Paparo Jr., a commander of the US Pacific Fleet, the People's Liberation Army has been on an alarming trajectory for the last 25 years, completely overmatching the US Navy. Currently, China's Navy has 79 more ships than the US, including 30 it added in the past year, half of which were large surface vessels. This puts China's ships at 370 and the US at 296. In 2023, China added 30 ships, and the US only added 2. China has been working swiftly and set a record by adding 3 new vessels on the same day in 2020. These 3 bad boys were the Zhen-class Type 094A ballistic missile submarine Shangqian 18, the Renhai class Type 055 destroyer Dalian, and the Yuxin class Type 075 amphibious assault ships Hainan. I'm sure I pronounced those wrong. The unveiling of the ships was a big deal, and they were added to the South China Fleet, which is responsible for operations around Taiwan and in the disputed South China Sea. The Changcheng 18 is an important part of the fleet because it is part of China's sea-based nuclear deterrent in its nuclear triad. The Dalian is one of a new class of advanced destroyers, and the Hainan is the first of a new class of warships that can carry aircraft, watercraft, and marine infantry for amphibious assault operations. This joint ceremony lit a fire in the US, and shortly after it began to use China as a pacing challenger. This year, China launched its largest and most advanced aircraft carrier called the Fujian. China has been working on it since 2022 when it completed its mooring trials, outfitting work, and equipment adjustments. This monster of a ship is 80,000 metric tons and is a step up from China's 66,000-ton Shandong and the 60,000-ton Liaoning. What makes the Fujian better is its electromagnetic catapult system, which allows it to launch larger and heavier aircraft than the Shandong and Liaoning. Warplanes carrying higher munition loads to farther distances will give the carrier a greater combat range than its predecessors did. The rival to the Fujian is the US Navy's newest carrier, the USS General R. Ford, which is the only other active carrier in the world with an electromagnetic catapult system. What the USS carrier has going for it is the fact that it's nuclear-powered, giving it the ability to remain at sea for as long as crew provisions last. In terms of size, Ford displaces 100,000 tons, and the US 10 Nimitz-class ships 87,000 metric tons. While the US wins the size battle, it is still behind in relation to its expansion. If China gains control of the South China Sea, the US will be in a lot of trouble. Currently, 50% of America's global output comes from the South China Sea. The other reason that the US has to focus its fleet is so that it can create a deterrent to China. According to Robert Murrett, a retired vice admiral, the goal is to deter China. And the biggest foreign policy challenge we will have for this generation is to make sure that Beijing understands any conflict in Asia is not in their interest. Publicizing the plan and showing its intentions to upgrade is part of how the US aims to keep China humble, especially in light of its increased military drills. According to this tweet by the Minister of National Defense, 11 P-LAN aircraft, 8 P-LAN vessels, and 1 official ship operating around Taiwan were detected up until 6 a.m. 9 of the aircraft crossed the median line and entered Taiwan's northern, southwestern, and eastern ADIZ. Later on in the night, Taipei also reported that the aircraft carrier P-LAN Liaoning and its escorts of cruisers, destroyers, and frigates had approached the Bashi Channel to the island's south. This area is of great strategic importance because the channel separates Taiwan from the Philippines and then links the South China Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Chinese Coast Guard activities have also accelerated, with many sighting them in Taiwanese waters. The sighting of Coast Guards in the area is no surprise, as China has increased its pressure on Taiwan in recent years. On a daily basis, China's military ships and aircraft operate in Taiwanese waters, and the Chinese Coast Guard has expanded its activities into areas that it has called gray zones. In these regions, it is argued that it has the legal right to the area and has chosen to quarantine it. Choosing to surround Taiwan with ships and aircraft is just as good as blockading it, and the P-LAN will begin to move slowly until it finally cuts the island off. President Xi Jinping is hell-bent on reuniting Taiwan with the old Republic of China, and he has been working slowly towards making it a reality. But let's take it back a bit so that you understand why Xi feels like Taiwan is a part of China. In the mid-17th century, Taiwan was administered by the Qing dynasty. Then, after the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 through 95, Taiwan was ceded to Japan, which occupied it for 5 decades until it was defeated in the Second World War. In China, there were divisions between the Kuomintang, the KMT-led government of the Republic of China, and forces of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and the two sides fought to gain control of China. There are some key differences between the two parties, including that one side is democratic and the other is authoritarian. Ideologically, the KMT was nationalist and the CCP is a communist party. After Japan's defeat, Taiwan was given back to China and it began to rule the island. Not long after this, the KMT and the CCP were at it again. And this time, the CCP won control over mainland China. In response to this, the leader of KMT and his 1.5 million supporters evacuated to Taiwan and began their own government. This became known as the Government of Exile. On the mainland, Mao Zedong consolidated control and established the People's Republic of China, while Chiang established a government in exile in Taiwan called the Republic of China, or the ROC. At first, the new government still claimed to be a part of China, but as time went on, it wanted to be recognized as its own government. The issue is still contentious, and currently there is a divide in the international community as to whether Taiwan is an independent state. The PRC initially wanted to work under a one country, two systems arrangement, but Taiwan rejected this. In 2016, things became more solid when Tsai Ing-wen of the DPP became Taiwan's president. Since then, the PRC has been working hard to get Taiwan back. In 2005, it passed a law that stated it would be allowed to use military action against Taiwan if it declared independence. Even diplomatically and economically, China has tried to intimidate Taiwan by blocking its attempts to participate in the UN and international forums. You may be wondering how the US is involved in all of this. While China's aggression is a problem, does it warrant the US stepping in? In the beginning, it seemed as if the US was backing Beijing. In 1979, the US agreed to recognize the One China policy, which stated that there is only one China and Taiwan is a part of it. But now the US is in a type of weird limbo with Taiwan. While it does not recognize it as a sovereign state, it has an unofficial relationship with Taiwan and offers Taiwan military and economic support. Basically, the US is trying to create a balance between not angering China and supporting Taiwan. The situation is very confusing, because in 2021, the US president stated that the US would defend Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. He received a lot of backlash for the statement, and the White House had to do some damage control. Although Washington is trying to play it safe, a lot hinges on Taiwan remaining independent. Taiwan is a good counterbalance to China. If Taiwan remains independent, it means that China's control in the South China Sea is limited. China already lays claim to the land that belongs to the Philippines and Vietnam and bulldozes its way around these islands. Having Taiwan remain a separate entity from China is a good buffer because it checks its power. Remember what we said earlier, 50% of the US global output is centered around the South China Sea? This means that the US should be working hard to ensure that access to the sea remains free and fair. If China gets dominance in the Indo-Pacific region, this will be the end of US global trade. The US also has military interest in Taiwan as well. Taiwan's strategic location is the perfect spot for the US to run operations and surveillance in the South China Sea. The US also runs special military exercises in the area. These special trainings are an opportunity for the US to showcase its strength and prepare for aggression with China. The exercises are called Annual Capabilities Exercises, and they simulate how defense would work if there was a potential Chinese invasion. On the face of it, it seems like the drills are harmless, but they give the US the military presence it needs in the South China Sea, and they allow for intelligence sharing. Taiwan is also a good trade partner to have, and the US and Taiwan work well together in the tech sector, especially in relation to AI and cybersecurity. As the US is working to dissociate from China's aggression, it needs to find a way to wean off its dependence on China and move on to Taiwan as an economic ally. All these long-term plans only work if Taiwan remains the Republic of China. Admiral Franchetti's 7-step plan is exactly what the US Navy needs to be able to reach parity. For the past couple of years, neglect has left the US shipmaking industry regressing, which is not good in times like this, where conflict is always imminent. Project 33 is an intense program that is aimed at ensuring that by 2027, the US Navy is up again. Hopefully, 2027 will just be a deadline and will not be the start of a war in the South China Sea.
China is planning on annexing some territory back from Russia once Russia falls apart. That's not me saying it, it's the Chinese social media that's saying it. In fact, we had a post go so viral on Chinese social media that foreign outlets covered it like Kyiv Post. The post basically lays out what the China's plan would be in case Russia falls apart. And China's plan is simple according to the post. They plan on taking back some territory that China believes Russia took over when the Chinese state was too weak back in 1800s. So before we get into all that history, let's look at the post. Watch it yourself.
What if one day Russia can't stand it? What if Russia is crushed by the United States? The country collapsed. There was a second disintegration split into dozens of small countries. Do you know what's going to happen? In less than 2 years, those small countries that are newly independent in the north will be stationed by the United States from northeast to northwest. The entire northern half of the country will completely lose the ability to strategically defend. No matter how advanced the missile defense system is, will lose reaction time. So friends, if Russia has a second disintegration for the future of the Chinese nation, our heavy army must rush north with a thunderous army. Seize Siberia, seize Beja Erhu, recover Wanyili, recover northeast, recover Kuye Island. Yinma Bay Bingyang, at that time the United Nations Charter was abolished. New international law must be governed by the People's Republic of China.
Now, as some of you guys may already know, a big part of the Russian Far East was part of China back in the Qing dynasty. But in the Treaty of 1958 and 1960s, the Qing dynasty gave up some land to Russia, the then Russian Empire, but the Chinese people always believed these land to be China's, and now they see an opening to get it back. Here we have a Twitter user Beefeater who shares a little bit more details about this claim. China's claims to Russia's Far East are fact-based and indisputable. The thoughts of some Chinese nationalists are focused on particular Russian city, one famous for its sea cucumbers, a popular Chinese delicacy. In China, the far eastern Russian city of Vladivostok has been known traditionally as Hai Sen Wai, meaning Sea Cucumber Bay. More to the point, as these patriots point out, it was once ruled by China. Amid the flourishing of Russia-China ties, said in a joint statement on March 22nd to have reached their highest level in history, a few Chinese have dared to recall how their country ceded vast swaths of territory, including Vladivostok, to the Tsarist Empire back in the 19th century. In the past month, they have fumed on social media over unequal treaties that took away the land. Chinese maps from the 13th century show the area of Vladivostok as Yongmingcheng, and to this day the port itself is still called Haiswan alongside the Russian imperial name of Vladivostok. It is notable that public discourse on decolonization regularly avoids any mention of Russia's continuing colonial occupation. Chinese and Korean claims over the Russian Far East are significant. There was a substantial Chinese population in the Russian Far East until Soviet mass deportation to China. Ethnic cleansing of the Far East peaked in 1930s. Before the Russian Revolution, the Chinese made up 41% of the registered labor force in then Amur and Primorsk Oblast. The actual number was likely higher as many Chinese did seasonal cross-border work as day laborers. Ethnic Russians were likely the minority, which is what drove Stalin, as always, to select the inhumane policy of mass expulsion to guarantee Russian supremacy. Russia is rotting and giving China a huge range of options with its declining neighbor. If current trends persist, China can reasonably expect its old territories to one day fall into its lap. Chinese leaders may well have better understanding of Russian decline than their Western counterparts. Russia is not a superpower, but is treated as a superpower as a remainder. Russian GDP is only 9 times greater than that of revenue of American retailer Costco, while the Chinese population is 10 times that of Russia. Chinese adjusted national wealth is more than 5.5 times that of Russia, and the Communist Party, CCP, is getting cheap oil and gas from Putin's regime while helping to prop up a large, if failing, autocracy. There's a reason why Russia constantly threatens the use of nuclear arms. The country is an economic dwarf compared to its geographical size. For now, Vladivostok can continue under the Russian flag with certain knowledge that one day it will most likely become Haisan-Wai, a city in China once again. Now, as if that wasn't enough, just recently we covered that how China signed a treaty with a weakened Russia to get better access to the Japanese Sea. So now that they can use the Russian River to have their warships and other ships travel to Japanese Sea without having to go around. Now we'll go over that later in the video, but just recently, Russia also got some even bad news from China. And this had to do with the fact that China was forcing them to negotiate in this war. The big reason people think China is forcing them is because as soon as Russian Deputy Minister Dmitry Medvedev had a meeting with Xi Jinping, he came out and said that Russia is ready for a compromise, and this was soon after Trump was elected. Now, we talked about this with none other than Diane Francis on our podcast, which is now moved to a new channel, so I'll link it down below and up above if you guys can please go check out our channel for the podcast. But here's the clip. So we can jump right into it. I know you follow the Russia-China relationship pretty closely, and I'm sure you saw today Dmitry Medvedev, the former prime minister, said that Russia is open to negotiations now, and that happened right after he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. What does that hint at, like how the meeting went?
Well, you know, the Europeans and the Americans are very upset with China because it is helping Russia. It originally said it wasn't, and it wasn't direct. They're not directly sending weapons, but they're sending equipment and components that allow them to make weapons. And they're also buying cheap oil from them, which is financing their war. So is India, for that matter. So everybody's very annoyed with China and India for doing that, although it's understandable. But the implication from what is said, and I wasn't there, I didn't hear what he said and so on, is that, you know, Medvedev was summoned to talk to Xi, who's the head of China, and China is telling everybody that they're pushing for a ceasefire and peace. They want the war to stop. They want to get on the good side of Trump, but also they've been pushing for this a long time. Let's not forget the fact that China and Russia have been enemies in the past. They're uneasy friends, and they're frightened of each other. And I think that China has repeatedly said privately, don't even think about using nuclear weapons, or, you know, you lose us, and all of that sort of thing. And going back to the beginning, just to retrace, the ambivalence that China feels toward, or Xi feels toward Putin, is that Putin came to the Winter Olympics in Beijing and announced that they had signed a deal, that they were friends for life, that they were friends without limits. And he failed to tell Xi, when they did the big photo opportunity with the Winter Olympics in the backdrop, that he was planning to invade in 2 days a sovereign nation for no reason. He didn't even tell his friend for life that, you know, his plans were that. I don't think he dared to. And so, you know, Xi was then caught in this awful position of having to remain supposedly friendly and play footsie with Putin, at the same time certainly not wanting to risk losing all their customers in America and Europe by being in a tight alliance with them. So I kind of believe China when it says, you know, it wants the war to end, and it's trying to do something in whatever way it can to dance around Putin to get him to cease fire.
And I know you covered this too. When North Korean troops got involved, China was not happy with that. And I wonder if Trump coming in office has any effect on Chinese-Russian relationship, or do you think that will continue probably? Like, does that change anything, or will continue as is?
Trump coming into office changes everybody's relationship with everybody. This is the new boy on the block, and he's a bully, and he's big. He's the biggest boy on the block. Nobody can touch the United States, economically, militarily, and in terms of influence. So, you know, this is a whole new equation in terms of geopolitics. He's completely upended it. I think that, you know, China is going to be a target of tariffs and all kinds of other things, because the Americans are fed up with the trade deficit situation, with the fact that in the past China's cheated and all that sort of thing, and is an arch rival economically. And, you know, they've also, China's also hinted around that it wants Taiwan back in its fold, although I don't think Taiwan and China's not stupid. You know, there's too many warships in the region that the Americans, the Australians, the Japanese, everybody has. There is no way they could invade Taiwan and get away with it. So, you know, they're kind of caught in this situation. And they have to tiptoe a little bit around what Mr. Trump wants. Now, what Mr. Trump wants is for the United States to continue to dominate the economic trade situation with China. He wants China to stop cheating, and he wants to put tariffs on China because of the low prices and low labor rates they have, which gets them a lot of business in the U.S. And so China would earn, shall we say, brownie points if, in fact, they are seen to be even just talking about or trying to nudge Putin to get to the negotiating table. And so that's kind of the drama that's going on right now. And it's not going to stop Trump from being tough on China, but maybe he wouldn't be as tough. So they're trying to sort of be helpful.
And I know recently you covered how Ukraine should deal with Trump, which we'll link in the card above and in the description. I highly recommend our audience to go check out your Substack. But you had an interesting point there that I haven't seen mentioned in other places, where China is actually buying up assets in Ukraine. I wonder if that's going to create a conflict between Russia and China, because there was a theory going around, which we covered on our channel too, that Russia is really going after Ukraine for the minerals Ukraine has.
Yeah, well, I broke that story on my Substack, and it was what Zelensky and the others have realized, which other countries have to, is that Trump is not a historian, he's not a diplomat, he's not a strategist, he's a business guy. So make me an offer, give me a deal, let's win-win. And so that's his approach, and that's the approach you have to make. So what Zelensky has done in his victory plan is not only ask for more weapons to pummel the heck out of Russia, which is actually it's on the ropes economically, but he also has highlighted the fact that Ukraine is in Europe the wealthiest European country in natural resources, apart from Russia, which is mostly Asian, but still. And they have as many resources, according to some estimates, as Canada or Australia has. And people don't realize this. You think of it as an industrialized country, a innovative IT country, and certainly an agricultural giant. But this place is full of everything: fossil fuels, critical minerals, everything you want, and $26 trillion worth. And so what Zelensky's basically saying to Trump and to the Europeans to a certain extent, hey, get rid of this guy, help us get rid of this guy, and help us rebuild the country, and we'll give you first rights to partner with us in all this wealth. And so it's a business proposition as much as anything else. It's not about, oh, we're a democracy, you got to save us, or these guys are bad. No, this is about making a deal. And that's something that Trump can certainly understand. Now, in the course of that, it's important to know, and I think I'm the only one that's printed it, but there are a number of Ukrainian oligarchs before the war, because I was in Ukraine a lot before the war, who were working on behalf of the Chinese. And as proxies of the Chinese, they were snapping up all this wonderful farmland in Ukraine. And the former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, in fact, surfaced as one of the biggest property landholders in the country, and I think he's a proxy for China because he made many visits to Beijing. So that's one thing. Another thing that Zelensky has, I think, said, there will be no Chinese ownership in Ukraine because they've helped the enemy. And that means that all these secret deals and hidden identities of ownership will have to become disclosed, and the Chinese will be kicked out, and they should be.
YouTube is still not a fan of a lot of topics we cover, and that means the videos get restricted and demonetized. That's why we recently launched memberships and Patreons. This way you guys can support the content we make directly if you're able to. Because we want to continue covering this type of topics even if advertisers don't like it. We like doing it, and hopefully you guys like watching it. That's why Patreon and memberships give us a way to continue doing this without worrying about YouTube demonetizing our videos. So if you're interested and you're able to support us, you can do so by joining our Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. The QR codes will be on the screen and the links in the description. Your support is greatly appreciated.